Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
They caught sight of the motel from the bridge that crossed the highway. It squatted on a kidney-shaped plot of pavement, surrounded on three sides by trees and dark hills. There was nothing and no one else around for miles. "There it is." Amanda reached out and grasped Wendy's hand, squeezing tightly. She was excited. They had done the silo facility in Chillicothe. They'd walked the 3 miles of track to the derelict rail depot in Hartwell. They'd explored the one-room schoolhouse in Cleves, the old factory in Hyde Park, and the deserted neighborhood off the highway behind Lookout Acres. All had been thoroughly boring, and Amanda wanted something more. A place with a rich, dark history. She'd almost given up on finding one when she'd overheard 2 girls in the university's common area talking about the Murder Motel. She'd asked some questions, done some Googling, and discovered the thing she'd been looking for had been hiding in plain sight, right under her nose. It had been something of a 9 days wonder back in the fall of 1983. News outlets across the state had run the story of how a man named Terry Lawton had come stumbling into the front office of the Royal Motel just after sunset, waving a pistol. He murdered 6 employees and 2 guests before turning the gun on himself. His wife's body was discovered at the couple's home, a hunting knife jammed deep in her belly, her guts spoiling on the kitchen floor. Their 7-year-old daughter, Jackie, was never seen again. The Royal Motel was shut down quietly and left to rot. No developers came to rehab it. No one bulldozed it to build something else in its place. It just sat, empty and waiting. People forgot the name Terry Lawton, forgot the names of the victims. It was regulated to the late-night conversations in bars and truck stops, and even that eventually dried up. For years, the story lay as dormant as the motel itself. Then, after some time passed, it found a second, vivid life amongst the kind of people who could really appreciate gruesome tales of blood and tragedy. All the kids say that a group of devil worshippers started using the place for rituals, that they had orgies and called up demons and communicated with the ghosts of the people who died there. Amanda grinned as she spun the yarn. They'd left the bridge and turned onto a road rough from neglect and full of potholes. Another story says a group of paranormal investigators went out there to stay overnight and study the place. They ran out screaming after only 3 hours. They disbanded the group and never spoke of that night again. Clark leaned forward from the back seat, pushing his face between the 2 sisters. The sun was bright, and he squinted out from beneath his red knit cap. "Is that true?" She shrugged. "Who knows? Probably not. The only thing that's for sure is that 9 people died there. The rest are just rumors." She raised her eyebrow theatrically. "But there are a lot of rumors. Everybody at Bridalfield has a story about this place, and there's a couple of websites that mention it." They bumped along for another couple of miles until the pines suddenly swept back from the road. A thick metal pole reached up from the scrub, topped with a sign that proclaimed Royal Motel, air-conditioned, free HBO. Just beyond that, on the right, lay their destination. A sagging 2-level affair, it sprawled in the shadows of the encroaching woods. Its yellow paint had faded almost to white. There was a check-in office at one end, and a tunnel which cut through to the rear of the motel. Every 10 feet or so were rooms, closed white doors accompanied by large naked windows. Further down were 2 stairways to the 2nd floor, and a glass enclosure where a long dead ice machine hulked. Wendy pulled into the parking lot, stirring drifts of dead leaves. No other cars passed down the road. They had the place to themselves. "Damn. This is legit." Clark's tone was hushed and respectful. "Yeah." Wendy shut off the ignition. But I wish it was closer to home. It's going to be dark soon. We should have started earlier. Amanda undid her seatbelt. We can spend the night in my dorm if you want. It'll be quiet. Everybody's gone for the holiday. She opened her door and stepped out onto the pavement. A smile spread across her face as she drank in the squalid atmosphere. Chipped and peeling paint, the empty flower pot outside the office door, the ghosts of parking space lines. She was in love. She pulled her pack from the front seat and began rummaging through it. Clark got out and stood next to her, stretching. He looked back in at Wendy. Yeah, that's a good plan. We can all spend the night together. In your dorm room, I mean. Makes sense. Amanda glanced over at him, amused to see his face had gone bright red beneath his scruffy beard. Yeah, we can't use my roommate's bed, so we're all going to have to squeeze into mine. She pulled her camera from her pack and began snapping pictures. Wendy stepped out and stood by the car. After a moment's consideration, she wrapped her scarf around her neck. It had been unseasonably warm for late November, but it was cold in the shade of the motel. She sniffed the air. Oh, what's that smell? The artificial click of Amanda's digital camera went off and the flash bloomed. I don't smell anything. She was fascinated with the grime on the windows. It made patterns that looked like handprints. Clark went around to Wendy's side and leaned against the car. No, there's definitely a smell. It's like dead leaves, moldy carpet, and raccoon shit. His voice dropped to an ominous growl. Or maybe it's the lingering stench of death. He chuckled and lit a cigarette. Don't be a dick. People died here. Wendy shut the driver's side door and sidled over to her sister. Is this one creepy enough for you? Amanda kept taking pictures, her eyes on the view screen, but she spoke as she moved the camera around. Another thing they say is that sometimes people driving by at night see lights on in the windows, and sometimes they see shadows in those lit-up rooms. Wendy hugged herself and shivered. Maybe people are staying here, squatters or something. Amanda looked up from her camera. And who's paying the electric bill? She slipped the camera strap over her shoulder and hoisted her pack. You guys ready to explore? Without waiting for an answer, she strode across the parking lot towards the front office. She stepped over a parking block onto the walk. Stubborn weeds clawed their way up between the cracks in the cement. She pressed her face up to the plate glass that fronted the office and put her hands to either side, trying to see in. This was where Terry Lawton had gunned down 4 of his 8. Actually, it was 10, counting the wife and little girl, she reminded herself. Victims. The night manager, the front desk clerk, and 2 maids. She felt a morbid thrill knowing that blood had been spilled just a few feet away. The window was nearly opaque with dust and grit, and it was very dark inside. She couldn't make out anything at all. She tried the door and found it locked, just as she'd expected. No big deal. She had her lockpicking kit. She heard Wendy and Clark shuffling up behind her and turned to face them. I say we start with the rear of the building, cut through the tunnel, see what's back there, maybe try a few of the rooms, then make our way back here. Finish with the office. What do you guys think? Wendy chewed on her lower lip. She looked uncomfortable. How many rooms do you want to go through? We can't stay here long. It's already 3:30. Jesus, Wen, we drove all this way. We're going to check out as many rooms as we can. We've got flashlights. Sorry, I was just asking. Clark tossed his cigarette to the ground and put his hand on Wendy's arm. Don't worry about it. We'll be all right. She gave him a withering look and shrugged his hand off. I know, I was just asking. Amanda left them behind. She went into the tunnel that connected the front of the motel to the rear. It was dark inside. An overlapping and confusing road map of graffiti spread out across the walls. She stepped back, trying to take all of it in. A lot of it was the usual childish vulgarity. Depictions of huge penises, impossibly large breasts, pot leaves, and the names of heavy metal bands. She particularly liked the one that said, April Priest plus beer equals blowjobs. Some of it, however, was quite strange. She took her camera and began shooting pictures. Each time the flash went off, it illuminated a small piece of the chaotic puzzle. Flash. 8 small figures in silhouette holding hands, their eyes round white holes. Flash. A crude drawing of a little girl in a dress and pigtails. Blank white eyes and her mouth drawn down in an exaggerated frown. Flash. La niña quiere como su alma. Salir y permanecer fuera hermanos. Flash. A bouquet of thorny stems crowned not with flowers, but with crescent-shaped eyes. Flash. Say hi to Jackie for me. Flash. Jackie sucks dicks. Below this, the addendum. Jackie eats, with a Z, dicks. Get it straight, fucker. Flash. Everybody up. Amanda's here. Encircled by a chain of white eyes. Amanda stumbled back, nearly dropping her camera. She leaned forward, so close her nose almost touched the wall. The circle of eyes was there, but what she'd thought were words now just looked like greasy black streaks. Her mind had played a little prank on her. She smiled as she turned and examined the writing on the opposite wall. This is exactly what I wanted. She shouldered her camera and headed cheerfully to the rear of the motel. She stepped out of the tunnel and into what had once been the Royal Motel's recreational area. To her right, a small structure stuck out perpendicular from the main building. It had no windows, just a gaping doorway. Faded paintings of Pac-Man, Q*bert, and Space Invaders decorated the front wall. She wondered if any of the old games were still in there, shrouded in cobwebs. She doubted it. People had been out here. Someone would have spirited them away if the owners had been stupid enough to leave them in the first place. A concrete courtyard spread out from the arcade across the back of the building. A few old weather-stained lounge chairs were strewn here and there. To her left, a bit further back, was a small swimming pool surrounded by a low fence. The gate had been torn away and left discarded on the ground. Amanda could see that the pool was half full of dark water. A breeze blew across it, carrying an odor like drowned things. A child's deflated pink intertube floated listlessly at the surface. It was the only spot of color to be found. Everything else was gray and damp. She wrinkled her nose, but was delighted all the same. Smells like dead fish. Wendy had come through the tunnel and Clark was standing behind her. I know. Amanda set her pack on the ground and hunkered down next to it. She opened it and began taking items out. She set a flashlight head down in the concrete, then placed a small plastic box next to it. As she did this, she heard Clark exclaim behind her. Oh shit, is that an arcade? All signs point to yes. Amanda flipped the lid of her case, revealing a set of small tools. Why don't you go check it out? You can take my light. It's all right, I've got one. He padded off to the arcade as she stood. She saw that her sister wore an amusing expression of boredom mixed with unease. Amanda knew the only reason Wendy went on these excursions was because she wanted to show everyone she was more than just a pretty face. She gamely clambered through garbage-strewn trailers, rodent-infested basements, and crumbling factories. She took photos and commented on blog posts, but Amanda knew she had no real interest in these lonely places. They were very different women. Wendy was tall, brunette, and gorgeous, while Amanda was small, athletic, and blonde. They were both intelligent, but everyone seemed to regard Amanda as the smart one, and it rankled Wendy. You okay, sis? Amanda pulled off her gloves and stuffed them into her jacket pockets. Wendy shrugged. Yeah, just tired and cold. What happened to the sun? Feels like the temperature's dropped 20 degrees since we got here. Well, the trees keep it pretty shady, and it's breezy. Amanda started towards one of the rooms that faced the courtyard. Want to come in here with me? Before she had a chance to answer, Clark came out of the arcade. His eyes sparkled. You guys gotta see this. There's a bunch more of that crazy shit spray painted all over the walls and ceiling. Names, little nursery rhymes, weird drawings. No games, though. Estelle was disappointed for a moment, but bounced right back. The creepiest part is that there's handprints in the dust all over it. Give me the camera. Amanda placed it in Clark's outstretched hand. I'll see it in a bit. I want to get into these rooms first. I'll come with you, Clark. Wendy turned her back to the motel. Amanda saw Clark smiling widely and felt a string of annoyance. He was so predictable. She watched them go into the arcade, and a moment later the flash of the camera began lighting up the darkness within. She turned and walked past the iron stairway that led from the courtyard to the second floor. She stepped beneath the overhang and walked up to a door. Room 21. Through the window, she could vaguely make out the shape of what was probably a bed frame. She tried the knob. It was locked. That made sense. All of the doors probably were. She selected one of the little tools in her case and slipped it into the lock, wiggling it back and forth. After a moment, there was a click and the knob turned in Amanda's hand. Her heart sped up as she pushed the door open and stepped into the room. She switched on her flashlight and moved the beam across the room. The metal bed frame was there, and that was about it. The room had been stripped of furniture, and the carpet had been torn up in a few places, showing bald cement. It felt empty. Well, of course, why shouldn't it? And disappointing. She gave it 30 seconds of attention before backing out of it and moving on. She pulled the door shut and then, on impulse, tried to open it again. It had locked automatically. She walked along to the next room and jimmied the lock without even trying it first. In this room, the bed came complete, mattress and all, with a filthy blanket scrunched up at the foot. A side table with 2 drawers sat aside the bed against the wall, and a long, low dresser sprawled beneath the window. She moved to the side of the bed and leaned over, touching the mattress. She had expected it to be damp for some reason, but it was bone dry. A cloud of dust puffed up around her hand. The springs screeched as she lowered herself onto it. She settled in and looked around the room. Amanda had really hoped to find some personal items, artifacts left behind by the last guests to stay here, or even junk that transients and squatters had forgotten. Anything that would connect to a human presence. She trained the flashlight's beam downward and swept it along the floor. More dust, more cobwebs, nothing else. She began opening the dresser drawers. The first 2 were empty. The third one contained a very large, hairy spider, and Amanda slammed it shut with a gasp. She uttered a breathless giggle and drew the last one open cautiously, shining the light in. A pencil rolled across the bottom. That was it. With a disappointed grunt, she leaned over and opened the top drawer of the side table. Inside was a thick, cheaply bound book. Well, now we're getting somewhere, she thought as she lifted the book out, giving it a good shake to dislodge any creepy-crawly stowaways. Someone had tried to blot out the title with black ink, but it was stamped into the cover and clearly legible. Holy Bible. Well, shit. Amanda felt a queasy wave of excitement in her belly. She tried to flip through it and found all the pages were stuck together. Someone had glued them shut. She was intrigued and turned to deface scriptures this way and that. She ran her thumb across the pages and found that it opened in the center of the book. She laid it open on the bed beside her. The original text had been pasted over with notebook paper, and something was written on it in tight little letters. She held up her light and bent over. As she did, Wendy and Clark's shadows passed in the front of the dirty window. She heard the door to the next room open as they entered. They thumped around, their voices muffled but loud. So much for not wanting to explore the rooms. It irritated Amanda that the only reason her sister was rooting around in there was because Clark was with her. Somehow he coaxed her into a room when Amanda could not. His crush was becoming unbearable. It had sneaked in and devoured a part of their friendship. It didn't matter, though, because Wendy would never give him what he wanted. Another part of Amanda wondered why it never even occurred to him to try and see if she would. Because Wendy is the pretty one. That's why. She shook the sour thoughts away and concentrated on trying to make out the writing on the pages pasted into the Bible. The handwriting was cramped and seemed to be in a language that Amanda couldn't even guess at, though every so often English words and phrases were peppered in. She read aloud, pronouncing as best she could. Briexo gulis bub sum nilshug, al kurit upsharsen, mene takil bub. Marked by its lividity, shub gomthog yoth kamog, sibyl nog bub helshig, aggrieved, and unburied. Lish Coilerig Sebs. The thumping next door suddenly intensified. It sounded like someone was hitting the wall just on the other side. Ugh, is she actually letting him fuck her? Amanda grimaced, disgusted at the thought. God, they know I'm in here. It was like they were doing it just to mess with her. Normally, she would find the idea ridiculous, but here, in this dark room with dust floating around her like dirty snow, it seemed completely reasonable. She stood from the bed, snapped the Bible closed, and stuffed it into her jacket pocket. She explored the rest of the room, shining her light in every gloomy corner and crevice. The bathroom was empty, and the closets held nothing but a couple of theft-proof wooden hangers. It seemed this room had given her everything it had. The Bible was a nice relic, though, and she couldn't wait to get it home and start researching the writing on the notebook paper. Someone, somewhere, had to have an idea of what it meant. As she reached for the knob, there was another thump from the room next door, and she rolled her eyes impatiently. Jesus Christ, guys! She opened the door, expecting the sudden onrush of daylight to dazzle her, but the sky had dimmed considerably. In fact, the sun had sunk low behind the hills, and the shadows of the pines stretched out long. Amanda pulled her phone from her pocket. The clock said 4:28. She stared at it for a few seconds and then looked stupidly back up at the sky, trying to reconcile the two. It couldn't have been much later than 3:40 when she'd gone into the room, and it seemed to her that she'd only been inside for 9 or 10 minutes at most. She moved slowly towards the next room, intending to ask Wendy and Clark if they'd noticed her long absence. Of course they hadn't. She reached out and knocked on the door. There was no reply. No sound of any kind. She knocked again and called out. Guys? Hey guys, you in there? Nothing. No more of the thumping. No more voices. She decided to just walk in and hope they'd finished. The doorknob was cold against her hand as she closed her fingers around it and turned. It was locked. She jiggled the knob, but it wouldn't budge. She leaned in close, putting her ear against the door. She strained to catch any sound from within. She swept her hair behind her neck and pressed more tightly. Was that something? A tapping? Just on the other side of the door. Maybe not. If it had been there at all, it was gone now. She pounded on the door and shouted, Hey, this is bullshit! It's not funny! Hey! The sound of her first rapping against the mute wood echoed across the pavement, startling some birds from the trees. There was no reply. She stepped away from the door. They weren't in there. She turned slowly and surveyed the courtyard. In the thickening shade, the swimming pool was black, the inner tube drifting listlessly across it, urged on by the breeze. The ruined gates that surrounded it were skeletal silhouettes. They offered no answers. She took one last look at the door and considered letting herself in with her pick. After a moment, she decided instead to try the next room down. She picked the lock and entered. The dark of the room was thicker than the last two. She turned on her flashlight and swung the beam around. She felt hurried now, less genuinely curious, and anxious about being caught there after sundown. She didn't need to see the bathroom, and there was no dresser or table in this room for her to explore. Just a bare bed frame. She was turning to the door when something on the carpet caught her eye. It was small and bright, startling against the dingy gray nap. It was a business card. She knelt and picked it up, shining her light on it. NOPE, Northern Ohio Paranormal Examiners. Getting to know the unknown. Matt Lauritsen, MS, Bridlefield University. So a paranormal group really had come out here. Shit. She shook the thought away with a jerk of her head. So what? She stood and shoved the card into her pocket next to the Bible. Not bothering to take a last look around, she stepped out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. Guys? Her voice was small. Where the hell were they? Amanda went back to the arcade, very aware of how quickly the sky was darkening. "Wendy? Clark?" She stepped through the doorway into the quiet. She switched on her flashlight. Dust swam in the air. She looked around the room, and her breath caught in her throat. There was graffiti on the walls and ceiling, as Clark had said, but he'd gotten it wrong. There were no words, no obscene pictures. Just hundreds, maybe thousands of eyes. All shapes and sizes, some detailed, some simple, all staring at her. She backed away from the wall and tripped over something in the middle of the floor. She landed hard on her rear and dropped the flashlight. It spun a few times and came to rest with the beam trained on what had tangled up her feet. The camera. She snatched it up by the strap and stood. She thumbed the power button and the little green light came on with a mechanical whine. She couldn't understand why Clark would leave it lying there. She turned on the view mode to see what the last picture he'd taken had been. It was a shot of Wendy in the doorway, framed by gray daylight. She wasn't smiling. There was a strange smudge in the background over her shoulder. Amanda pressed the little plus sign, enlarging the picture and scrolling it slightly to the right. It wasn't a smudge, but a shadow. A person standing behind her sister. The sun was almost gone, a fading pink glow behind the silent pines. She stepped out into the shady courtyard and yelled as loudly as she could. "Wendy! Wendy, please!" She desperately hoped they were messing with her. She wouldn't even be mad. She was ready to leave now. Her footfalls were loud as she hurried across the pavement. She turned and went into the tunnel, calling for her sister as she went. She had never wanted to see Wendy as badly as this before in her life. A knot of dark worry bloomed in her chest. She needed her sister, needed to wrap her arms around her beautiful shoulders and feel her rightness. Amanda could see the car out in the front parking lot. It was running, and the headlights were on. The front doors were thrown open wide, but no one was inside. She was about to step into the parking lot when she realized with a start that something was wrong with the tunnel. She shined her flashlight across the walls and gasped. All the writing had disappeared, replaced by more mute, indifferent eyes. She remembered chuckling at the silliness of the adolescent graffiti. April Priest plus beer equals blowjobs. She knew it had been there. A scream crawled up her throat, but she struggled fiercely to keep it inside. She did not want to lose control. She turned away from the eyes. What if they started blinking? And rushed to the car. The heater was running. Amanda stuck her head in the driver's side and glanced in the back. It was empty. Only Wendy's scarf lying abandoned on her seat gave any indication she'd been there. There was no sign of Clark at all. Amanda's heart was pounding. She turned and looked back at the motel. Where could they be? They had to be fucking around with her. They had to be. She sat down behind the wheel and switched the ignition off. No sense wasting gas. She pressed down on the horn, letting it blast for a long time. She slammed her fist down on it in a staccato beat. Why weren't they coming out, laughing at her for being scared? This had all been her idea. This had been what she wanted. A really spooky location to explore, a bad place. It would be hilarious for them to turn the tables on her. Mean, maybe, but funny in a dark way. Teach her a lesson. She knew now that she needed one, about showing respect for the past and the places that still reeked of it. Minutes passed and the cold crept in. The only sound was Amanda's breathing. She pulled the door shut and the windows fogged up. She tried calling Wendy's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She thought about dialing the police, but what would she say? That she and her friends had been trespassing on a piece of property where a bunch of people had been murdered years ago, just to poke around for laughs, and now her sister and friend had somehow disappeared? that maybe they were playing a cruel joke on her, but she was terrified that they weren't. The longer she waited in silence with the dark drawing down, the idea seemed less and less crazy. She had just pressed the 9 and the 1 on her keypad when a voice called out in the gloom. "Amanda, hey!" It was Clark. She flung the door open and jumped out. At first, she couldn't tell where his voice was coming from. She scanned the front of the motel and was startled to realize he was leaning out the open door of the office. How the hell did they get in there? "Asshole! What's wrong with you?" She tried to sound angry, but the relief in her voice was impossible to hide. She almost wanted to laugh. "Come on, let's get out of here." "Not yet. Come in here. There's something you've got to see." Amanda rolled her eyes. She had lost all desire to explore the Royal Motel. She'd seen enough. As far as she was concerned, it was time to maybe look for a new hobby altogether. She shook her head and called back. "No, come on, I'm cold. Where's Wendy?" "She's in here. She wants you to see this. Hurry up." His small form, barely visible in the dark, disappeared back into the office, letting the door snick shut. Amanda was annoyed all over again. These two were real pieces of work. She left the car behind and strode to the door. They were acting like mean little kids, bullies. They were probably hiding in there, waiting for her to enter so they could jump out and scare her. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. She would steel herself for the shock and show no reaction. She reached out and pulled the door open. She stepped into the heavy darkness and readied herself for whatever they had in store for her. She realized too late what a horrible mistake she'd made. The door closed behind her, enfolding her in darkness, but she could still see well enough to know the room was full of people. Arms, legs, bellies, eyes, and feet swam out of the shadows. With a choked scream, she threw herself back against the door. It wouldn't budge. The people in the dark didn't move. They just watched as she flung herself over and over against the unyielding glass, pounding her fists uselessly. She cried and called for help, called for Wendy and Clark, and beat at the door. It wouldn't open. She tried to punch through the glass, but it was too thick. No one made a sound behind her, not until she slid to the floor, tears streaming down her cheeks, sobs turning to exhausted dry heaves. Then a voice spoke up, one she had never heard before. The voice of a little girl. "No time for that now, Amanda. Everybody's here." There was a childish giggle, and sudden light filled the room. Amanda didn't want to turn around. Every instinct she had cried out against it. But of course she did. Ancient dead bulbs in the ceiling glowed with phantom power, revealing the small crowd who stood watching her. 5 men, 3 women, their clothes filthy and tattered, stained with age and blood. One of the women was missing her right eye along with most of the right side of her face. Her hair was a matted bird's nest that hung over the dark wound like a curtain, and Amanda could see bugs squirming in it. Another, a man wearing a loud sport coat and jeans, had a ragged hole in his shirt, just above his belt. Something was hanging out of the tear. Something that looked like gray-black sausage, clotted with dark sludge. He regarded her from behind lightly tinted glasses, unperturbed by her scrutiny. She looked from face to face. They all watched her wordlessly. Their eyes were sad. Flies buzzed everywhere. She could feel them lighting on her cheeks and brows and flitting away again. And there was a smell, thick, rank, and horribly sweet. I am sharing a room with ghosts. I wish I was a ghost. The gravelly voice came from a corner off to her left. Against her better judgment, she turned to look. Sitting against the wall, his knees drawn up to his chest. A broad-shouldered man covered in dust. A spray of maroon spread out across the wall just above his head, stark in the sallow light. The revolver he'd used to kill himself and the other 8 people in the room lay at his side, garlanded with cobwebs. Ghosts don't know they're dead. Oh, stop being grumpy. It was the young girl's voice again. Amanda snapped her head around and found herself face to face with its owner. She was 7 or 8 years old. When she died, a merciless part of Amanda's mind amended, with long blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore a strawberry shortcake t-shirt with frilly sleeves over a pair of red gym shorts. The shirt was a bit faded but clean, as was the girl's hair and skin. Her eyes were bright, her face fresh. She was in complete contrast to the other things that shared the room with her. It was perhaps in deference to this distinction that their dead eyes glowed with adoration as they gazed down upon the little girl. She drew very close to Amanda and smiled. Her teeth were white and perfect, but her breath, her breath was vile, like the wet, clogged odor of the swimming pool out back, but much stronger, much closer. "Jackie?" Amanda had known the moment she'd heard the girl's voice, but now, looking at her, breathing in her foul reek, it seemed necessary to say out loud, "You're Jackie Lawton." The girl's face lit up, delighted, but not surprised. "Yep, and you're Amanda Corcoran. I'm glad you came." From the corner, the dead, but not ghostly, he'd been very clear on that. Terry Lawton moaned miserably. "I'm sorry. I thought they brought her here to kill her. I didn't know." The mirth drained from Jackie's eyes and she spoke through suddenly clenched jaws. "Daddy, I told you to stop being so grumpy," he sobbed. Or maybe he chuckled. It was hard to tell, but words kept spilling from his spoiled lips. "They brought her here, but that's what she wanted. It's what she was waiting for. How could I know? Oh, Sharon, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know she had that knife. I could have stopped her, maybe." His voice gurgled and rasped. Jackie's face suddenly snapped away from Amanda. It flew back towards her father's body, carried on a neck grown suddenly long and thin. Her ponytail flew out behind her head like a poisonous comet's tail, and the sound of her teeth, chomping together, was hideously loud as she spoke. "Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up! I told you never to talk about Mama! Never, ever, ever!" Now it was clear the man was laughing. It was an awful sound. "Or what? You can't make this any worse. I'll say what I want. You're the one who killed her! You were a terrible daughter!" His words dissolved into a series of wheezing coughs that in turn lapsed back into sludgy, underwater gurgles. "I spared her this." Jackie's voice was no longer like a little girl's. It wasn't like anything human at all anymore. It was as if the buzz of cicadas in high summer had formed into words. "Because I loved her best. I loved her only. I spared her so you would suffer this, Daddy." The head pulled back on the serpentine neck, a triumphant sneer wrinkling her lips. "I'm leaving you here. My flock is coming with me, but you'll stay behind with the new residents." Terry Lawton's face crumpled with fear and terror. "No. I'm sorry, sweetie. I take it back. Please, please, please don't leave me here with them. Please, Jackie. Please!" With horrifying speed, Jackie thrust her hand forward and clamped her open mouth over her father's. For a moment, it looked like they were sharing a deep, lover's kiss. But then Jackie pulled back violently, Terry's brown tongue dangling between her teeth. She tossed her head back, letting it slide down her gullet like a pelican, swallowing a fish, and then smiled. I told you to stop talking. As if this pronouncement had some other significance, the dead people in the office all raised their hands above their heads in unison and chanted in low, hissing tones. Midhor chagro lor shubkamag. Midhor chagro lor shubkamag. Jackie swung her head back to Amanda, hovering above her like a jack-o'-lantern. Her eyes had become huge, empty sockets that glowed bright white, and her teeth had grown long and sharp. But when she spoke, her voice was that of a little girl again. I'm sorry to leave you with him, but he should be quieter now. Amanda had no idea she would ever be able to speak again, but she surprised herself by responding. What do you mean? Where's my sister? Where's Wendy? Jackie's grin spread to an impossible width. Even in this form, childish glee capered on her face, and it was abominable. She sang in her high, sweet voice. Wendy, Wendy, her arms and legs are bendy. Before she could stop it, Amanda's hand flew from her side and struck the monstrous face hanging in the air before her. It was like striking warm, wet clay. She recoiled with a gasp, but couldn't contain her words any more than she could her open palm. Where's my sister, you fucking whore? Jackie's crooning abruptly ceased. She closed her mouth and regarded Amanda solemnly. It seemed like a long time passed. Minutes. Hours. It was hard to say. Silence crept in. The dead watched impassively. Terry hadn't moved in some time. He just sat in his corner with his head cradled in his arms. Amanda got the idea she was dreaming, maybe sick with a terrible fever, and relief began to flood through her. But then she got a strong whiff of the room and of Jackie's breath, and knew it was no dream. Finally, Jackie spoke. My flock, my friends, picked this place because they were waiting for me to be born. They knew I would be special. In fact, they helped bring me here, to this world. Her human voice had been left behind for good. Her words buzzed and rattled. They spent years reading books, learning languages. They hurt people, they killed people. They watched for signs, and when I was born, they found me. My daddy didn't know what I was, but I think my mama did. She knew, but she didn't care. She loved me anyway. That's why I let her die free. At that, Terry moaned hollowly, but Jackie didn't waste even a glance on him. She just looked deep into Amanda's eyes, droning like the voice of madness. They didn't expect Daddy to show up here with his gun. He thought they killed her and kidnapped me. He followed them back here. They thought he spoiled their plans. The ritual. But I knew it was going to happen that way. It must. There always has to be a sacrifice. I told them we'd walked out of here in the darkness and glory, but I never said they would be walking out alive. This place has to be fed, guarded, tended, and fed. Always. Someone always has to stay behind. I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. She stretched her tiny hand out so far beneath her floating head and reached into Amanda's jacket pocket. She grasped the defaced Bible and pulled it free, clutching it against her chest. People have come and gone before. Some of them sensed us. Some of them saw us. We could always show little bits and pieces of ourselves, aspects, whispers, visions. No one ever stayed here very long, though. Even the ones who came looking for us. But you pressed on, and you found this. Our absolution. Amanda's thoughts were a muddy swirl of fear and confusion, but the memory of reading the words from the Bible cut through the haze with cold clarity. Fresh tears began to spill down her cheeks. She'd never felt so lost before in her life. Wendy. She just wanted to see her sister. That was the only thought that seemed to have any light to it. If only she could see Wendy, then maybe things could still be all right. Jackie nodded, her ponytail bobbing joyfully to and fro. Yes, maybe it's time for you to see your sister and your friend. Would you like that? The words sounded like poison in the demon's mouth, but Amanda nodded vehemently. She didn't care what came next. The idea of seeing Wendy at that moment had become everything. Jackie reared up off the floor. Her neck had retracted, bringing her head closer to her body, but the rest of her had begun to change shape. Her arms and legs had multiplied while she'd been speaking with Amanda. 6, 8. It was hard to tell how many limbs she now had, and they'd grown longer, and many jointed. Her back was bowed inward and elongated, tearing free of the strawberry shortcake shirt, and she seemed fuller, plumper. Amanda saw these things and understood somewhere deep inside that she should be screaming and pounding her head against the glass of the front door until she lost consciousness. But her love and concern for Wendy would not allow that to happen. Not yet. The Jackie thing, now standing 6 feet above the filthy floor, skittered with anthropodic grace across the room. Her retinue of dead worshippers stepped to either side to allow her passage, and she disappeared into the room behind what had once been the check-in desk. Amanda waited, trying not to think about the flies crawling in her hair, the chill of all those lifeless eyes upon her, or the way Jackie's abdomen had undulated between her spindly legs as she moved away. She tried to think about nothing other than seeing her sister. She didn't wait long. A few minutes after Jackie had disappeared into the back, 2 shadows came shuffling into the room. They shoved past the small, silent congregation that huddled beneath the fluorescent ghost lights and stopped in front of Amanda, swaying gently. Amanda took one look at her sister Wendy, whom she'd built tents out of blankets with when they were little, who'd been the first person she called when she lost her virginity, who she'd confessed her stupid, useless crush on Clark to, and began to scream. Wendy's face had been smashed in. Her jaw had been wrenched horribly to one side and crushed. Her lips were split wide, exposing shredded gums and a jumble of teeth. Her beautiful dark hair was matted to her face with dark, tacky blood. Her nose had been obliterated, reduced to a red, wet channel. Her eyes were bright, though, bright and aware, and staring at Amanda with dull hate. Beside her, Clark stood with his head twisted nearly around backwards, his skull crushed above the right temple. One eye socket had been fractured, and his eyeball had sunk into it, caught in the oozing crack. Blood and brains leaked from the gash in his head and down onto the collar of his coat in pink and red lumps. His good eye was also trained on Amanda, sad and afraid. Jackie reappeared behind and above them. She was huge now, almost filling the room. She had sprouted long dragonfly-like wings that shimmered in the sick light. She'd shed her clothes and her body had become segmented. Eyes like white toadstools opened up all along her sides, lidless and glistening. The worst, though, was that her face was still more or less that of the little girl she had been. Amanda, summoning the last bit of sanity she possessed, howled angrily at the creature towering over the bodies of her sister and friend.
You killed them! Oh, God! You killed Wendy!
The thing that had never really been a little girl named Jackie Lawton at all opened its mouth and laughed in its nightmare drone. Me? Don't be silly. I've never killed anyone. You did that. Amanda rose up off the floor, her fear and grief buried under an avalanche of cold fury. She could stand no more lies. She would beat this monster into the floor with a heavy, blood-soaked flashlight she held in her left hand before finding a way to... When had she picked up the flashlight? She remembered leaving it in the car with her pack. Didn't she? How had it gotten bloody like that? Whose hair was matted to the front plate? She looked back up and the room was empty. Jackie was gone. Her dead acolytes were gone. Terry Lawton was gone. All was dark, but she still had the flashlight in her hand. She thumbed the switch and it came on. The light filtered through a red haze. She shone it around the room. Not everyone had gone. Wendy and Clark lay on the floor in pools of drying blood. They didn't move. After all of that, it was strange to see dead people acting dead. She aimed the beam of the light around the room. One other thing seemed to have been left behind. Terry Lawton's pistol. She crawled over to where it lay and sat up against the wall, drawing her legs up to her chest. She set the flashlight down and picked the gun up. She wondered if it had any shots left. She pulled the hammer back and heard the chamber click into place. Her curiosity grew. She wondered how the barrel would feel in her mouth. After a moment, she put it between her lips to find out. It was cold. She sat that way for a while before she realized someone else was in the room with her. She looked up and in the light cast by the flashlight saw the silhouette of a young girl just inside the door. A voice that reminded her of summertime and mosquito bites whispered to her, "This place feeds on tragedy." Amanda nodded. She'd finally figured that out. Sometime later, she realized she was alone again. The batteries in the flashlight died. She didn't know if her eyes were open or closed. But the gun was still in her mouth. With a sigh, she leaned her head against the wall and pulled the trigger. They caught sight of the motel from the bridge that crossed the highway. It squatted on a kidney-shaped plot of pavement, surrounded on three sides by trees and dark hills. There was nothing and no one else for miles.
There it is,
the older boy said to the younger one from astride his bike.
They found the bodies of her sister and her boyfriend in room 23. Their heads were busted open. She beat them both to death with her flashlight, and there was brains everywhere.
The younger boy paled. He'd begun to regret coming along on this trip. Brains?
Yeah, everywhere. And more brains where she killed herself in the front office.
Dibs on any cool stuff we find, like bullet casings. Oh, all right. The younger boy had no qualms giving up dibs on anything they might find in the Royal Motel. It had gained a nasty reputation in the couple of years since the murder-suicide, and he couldn't for the life of him remember how he'd let himself get talked into this excursion. His goal now was to get in and out as quickly as possible, but he knew that his friend had come along bearing tools for breaking locks. It would not be easy to dissuade him from exploring every room.
Last one there eats dog shit.
The older boy stood on his pedals and began his descent to the deserted road below. No one had passed that way since they'd heard of the motel. After a moment, the younger boy shook his head and followed, hoping they'd be done before dark.
I didn't plan on staying at a motel that night. My apartment is normally a perfectly nice, pleasant, and comfortable place to stay. Unfortunately, the notice on the door of the building said we had to make other arrangements for the next 2 days. Why, the note didn't say, but I heard a neighbor had overheard the super talking about termites or something. It was especially upsetting because with everything else going on out in the world, travel wasn't exactly the greatest thing to be doing right now. Chances were he was even lying about it, that he just wanted the building to himself so he didn't catch anything. But choosing between having to shore up somewhere and having bug spray in my nose and on my toothpaste, I'd take my chances with the unknown. I don't have family close by, and all of my friends were huddled together with their families and didn't have the space for me anyway, so I started driving around. Most hotels were dark, save for a few cars in the parking lot, and had signs up saying they had no public rooms available. The Ophidian Motel was the only place I could go that was open, and by the look of it, not too many people were interested in taking them up on the offer. I couldn't blame them. The place probably hadn't been properly sanitized in months. It was one of those single-level places that try to look quaint on the outside, but you know nothing quaint happens behind those closed doors. Still and all, it was the only game in town for me, and with it being a few blocks from the interstate and my apartment, it was convenient enough that if things went bad, I could go back to my super's apartment and sleep in front of his door if I needed to. Hell, even if he made up the bug spraying just to get everyone away from him until this all blew over, maybe this would make him change his mind. I went in to see the front desk clerk. Bored, young, looking at his phone and sighing. I went up and handed over my card. 2 nights, please. He looked up at me and then at his phone. You know, you should probably be home. This stuff affects the older population way worse than the rest of us. Dick, I'm not that old. And even if I was, he didn't need to be talking that way. Not the time. 2 nights, please. He handed me a bunch of paperwork, and while I filled it out, I nearly jumped as the big green phone at the desk rang. I looked at the clerk, who ignored it. I wondered if he even knew what it was. Aren't you going to answer that? He shook his head. This time of night, it's always robocalls or prostitutes. One tries to take my money and the other one I can't afford. Cute. I finished my paperwork and waited until he swiped my card and gave me a room key. An actual key, not one of those key card things everybody uses. He sprayed it with disinfectant and handed it over. He held up the bottle. Want me to spray you, too? I looked at him, and then at the bottle, which was a bleach-based Lysol knockoff. No, but I recommend you keep spraying yourself if you need to. Don't need to catch anything from an old fart like me. I left, watching him shrug, then spray down the counter where I was. I didn't expect much from the room, but then I don't think many people ever do. Still, it was more pleasant than I expected, with a microwave, mini bar, widescreen TV, though one of those cheapy ones that sell for $50 at your local retail store with no name brand on it, a round table and chair, and a queen-sized bed. I was surprised it didn't have a quarter-operated magic fingers machine attached to the bed, though some bolt holes in the frame and headboard suggested it might have had one, years ago. There were only 2 doors in the room besides the entry door, The one to the bathroom, big enough to fit half a person comfortably, and the door to the adjoining room, next to the head of the bed. Not even space for a closet. I tossed what clothes I had brought onto the chair, turned on the TV, and settled in on the bed. After a few minutes, I remembered there was a vending machine outside and figured I'd grab a snack and a drink. When I left the room, I could hear the TV set almost as clear as day, even as far as 10 feet away from the room. Paper-thin walls. Figured. I was at least glad there didn't seem to be anyone else here, not only so I wasn't bothering anybody, but hopefully I wouldn't be hearing anyone, well, enjoying the company of each other would be a nice way of putting it. I went to the vending machine, situated on the wall next to the office, and was about to put in my dollar when I heard the desk phone ring again. Jeez. Even in the office, the walls were thin. But I heard the clerk pick up. Funny. I thought he said it was all robocalls this time of night. I held off putting in my dollar for a moment. If I could hear him, chances are he could hear me, and I kind of wanted to hear what kind of call he was getting. Might be worth a chuckle, if anything. Hello? Yeah, sorry, couldn't answer earlier. Taking a reservation. No, wait, I know, but trust me, you'll be fine. Look, you know me. I wouldn't let it bother you. It's just one guy. It'll be fine. Okay, see you in a bit. The phone clicked. I began to wonder who that was on the other end of the line, but then it clicked. He said robocalls and prostitutes. Even if they weren't for him, he probably had some kind of side arrangement with people who did. Who knows, maybe I'd catch sight of a local celebrity. TV anchor, city council. My super. Anybody was possible. Guess I would be hearing loud, obnoxious noises through the wall tonight after all. Even if they took a room all the way at the other end of the motel, I'd probably still hear it. I waited a minute or two before I bought my stuff, acting like I hadn't been standing outside listening the whole time, then went back to my room, climbed into bed, left the TV running, and called it a night. Even with the infomercials playing, I was still woken up by the sound of a car door slamming and footsteps. Now, I expected to hear 2, maybe 3 pairs, but the scuffling I heard outside was a lot more than that. It had to have been a group of 6, 7 people easy, but definitely not the sounds of a John and his lady going off to spend the night. I also heard more than that. It was muffled, but I could hear someone sobbing, moaning, like they had a gag in their mouth. I almost rushed to the window to look out when I heard voices in the parking lot. It was the front desk clerk and another. A deeper voice, but hoarse, like he had done a lot of coughing or yelling lately.
The room is ready.
Just like always, man. I'm telling you, there's no better time than tonight.
And just the one guest.
Haven't seen anyone else, and it's just been his car in the parking lot.
Then take care of it in the usual way. And keep it quiet. And this is yours.
I heard something change hands, and as one set of feet shuffled away, the other stayed in place, and I could hear something flicking, like someone digging through a roll of money. This was not some typical sex-related side business going on. I was wondering what I had gotten myself into when I heard keys jingling, and my doorknob started to unlock. I pretended to be asleep. It may not have been the best thing for me to do, but it was all I could think of. I think part of me was just scared of what was happening, and the other part wanted to see what was going on. With one eye squinted, I watched in the hazy light of the TV as the door opened and the clerk came in. He kept an eye on the bed while moving to the table, where he took my keys and put them in his pocket. If it had stopped at stealing my car, probably with the intent to chop shop it, I could have lived with that. Just gone on my merry way and ignored the weirdness going on here. But after he pulled out the switchblade and popped it open, I knew no matter what, I wasn't going to be killed over it. Not without a fight. I snored slightly and shifted a little. Those made him hesitate and take a step back. I took the opportunity to flop my arm over the bed. He waited a minute or so longer and then moved closer, holding the knife low. It looked like he planned to hold my mouth and plunge the knife in underhand, stabbing me as much as possible before I could react. Had I actually been asleep, he may very well have succeeded. He'd done this before, I could tell. He came in close, ready to cover my mouth. He leaned up against the bed. With my free arm, I grabbed the back of his jeans, finding his hamstring, and squeezed. He was so surprised that he yelped for a moment, loosening his grip on the knife, and he tried to drop to one knee. Letting go of his leg, I grabbed his head and slammed it into the headboard as hard as I could. He fell to the floor. I went into his pocket and got my keys, took the knife from the floor, and left him there. I didn't know if he was dead, and I didn't care. I had thankfully slept in my clothes, so all I had to do was grab my bag of stuff and get out. I went to the car and was about to hop in when I looked over at the other rooms in the Ophidian. I saw one that had lights on in it. Not lamplight, but a flickering, low light, like a room full of candles. There was a low sound, like chanting. Several voices all speaking at once, and in the midst of it, the terrified sobbing I had heard earlier, sounding like it was getting more desperate. I looked out at the street. Even at this late an hour, cars would be bustling by. But now, nothing. Everyone was terrified as it was. I doubt the police would even be able to come in time. I really wish I knew what came over me. I'm no hero, but maybe I was just a little pissed off at almost being murdered while I slept, and I didn't want it happening to anyone else. I went over to the room, and with all the strength I had, I kicked the door. The chain on the inside had been pulled to prevent entry, but the hinges were so old and rotted that it didn't matter. The door flew open the opposite way, leaving the door hanging from the security chain alone. Inside were a group of figures, all in black robes. One stood and moved toward me, and in the middle of the circle, I saw a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, bound, gagged, nearly naked, and absolutely terrified. The one who came toward me placed his hand over my mouth and, with very little effort, pushed me up against the wall. The hand holding me was gray, wrinkled, almost mummified, but strong enough that I could feel my jaw ready to crack against the pressure. If he had squeezed any harder, it would have broken for certain.
This isn't for you. You have seen too much.
It was the same deep, hoarse voice that had spoken outside my window. The hood of the robe fell back, and what was underneath was worse than I imagined. A gray, wrinkled head, shriveled, bald. If it had once been a person, it was barely one now. I tried to pull his hand away from my face, but as strong as he was, I could barely manage anything. I could now see, in his other hand, he held a strange, intricate dagger. It had a blade that zigzagged like a snake, and on the handle was a bottle screwed into it like the bottom of an airbrush gun. In the blade itself, there were grooves, as if it was designed to collect blood or something in the bottom of it. As I fought, he seemed to be slowly lowering the blade to a spot near my stomach. He turned to the others.
Not as fresh as hers. But will anyone here mind an appetizer before the main course?
The others laughed. They all had similar, raspy, coughing voices. As he looked away, I tried to dig into my pocket for the switchblade I still had there. I felt it and pulled it out, keeping it hidden as best I could. He turned back and pressed the blade into my stomach. Not far, just the tip of it. While it was painful, the smile he gave me was what panicked me the most and forced me to act. I clicked the switchblade and sliced at his wrist. I expected blood. I expected a grunt of pain. I expected just about anything except what actually happened. His wrist severed completely from his arm and fell to the floor. He looked down at it with his yellow, rheumy eyes, more surprised than anything. But where you'd expect to see bone, blood, anything at all, there was just a void. Underneath the gray, wrinkly skin was an empty shell. Or maybe not quite empty. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Greenish gray, thick, oily, writhing. Like it was going to push its way out of the arm like a tube of toothpaste. The mummified man quickly gripped his wrist hole closed and reached down for his hand, as if he meant to keep something from emerging. I saw my chance. With my jaw aching and the puncture wound on my stomach stinging, I ran forward and grabbed the young girl off the floor. The others reached for me, but I slashed out with the knife, and I saw a finger fall here, a hand there, and the one so injured also grabbed their arms, fighting to control something that wanted out. The escape itself was a blur. I barely remember anything beyond that until we were both in the car, the keys turned, and peeling out of the parking lot. Nobody followed us. I didn't know why, and frankly, I didn't care. I found a brightly lit street corner right off the interstate, where I could finally see a few lazy cars drifting by. I tried my best to calm her down, and between my hands and the switchblade, was able to remove her gag and her bonds. I talked to her, asked her name, where she was from, where she wanted me to take her. She gave me everything she could. She had been kidnapped almost a month ago. She had no idea what was going on in the outside world. She'd been locked in a room, by herself, after somebody had grabbed her while waiting at the bus stop for school, with only occasional bits of food shoved into her cell. Then, today, Somebody in a robe, she wasn't sure if it was one of the ones in the room or not, gagged her, bound her, and put a bag over her head and threw her into a car. I wouldn't have believed she didn't go without a fight, but after a month of little food and the strength of the man who attacked me, I didn't doubt one person could have done it. I asked her if she knew anything about the people who had taken her. "All I know is they wanted me scared. Fear makes it stronger," they said. But she didn't know what that "it" was. They never said any more. She assumed they didn't need to. After we gave our statements to the police, they were able to call her family, and she was reunited. They questioned me for a while, and I told them everything, except the fact that the kidnappers were some kind of hideous alien freaks. That I knew they would never believe. They asked if I saw a vehicle to run a license plate. I told them I hadn't bothered, because I just wanted to get the hell out of there. Don't want to believe my story? That's fine. I don't blame you. Anybody can make up anything online. But I can tell you this. I've learned a few things since that night. First, I found out what it was. Adrenochrome. It's a substance everybody has in them, made by the adrenal glands. It's out there if you want to buy it, but rumors say that there are certain people that get off on the high it produces, that it can extend life, and the only way to produce the best is to induce fear. And the best fear comes from younger people. Well, based on what I saw that night, maybe something tempted people, powerful people, to sample this stuff, and now they can't get on without it. They need to keep their existence a secret, to go on with their horrible, extended lives, snatching health and joy from the lives of people, especially children. Is it any wonder why there's a market out there for the slave trade? I've since moved out of my apartment, and I've sold my car. Front desk clerk has my credit card info, and probably my license plate. If I killed him or not that night, chances are someone has my information, and I need to hide it. But I haven't even gotten to the best part. See, I did see a local celebrity that night. I've been to his website. He's running for re-election, local city council, just as I guessed. And he just put out a video. Looks like a perfectly healthy 37-year-old. Thing is, his dad was a city council member too. I've seen pictures. Funny how both of them look exactly the same. They've been doing this for a long, long time. I saved one, but how many haven't been? How many have been drained by that awful knife? But I still think the most horrible thing is what tried to escape from that wrist that night. Something saw an opening and was trying to force its way into this world. Something so monstrous, even they tried to keep it held within. Something held back, protected by only a paper-thin surface.
Daddy, why is Mommy so cold? She was dead. Maurice knew that much, but why was she so cold? His father, a stout man named Gregory, was silent. Everyone knows we die. Not even children deny it. Yet knowing a fact and believing it are different. Maurice knew his mother lay dead in her casket. Gregory explained the custom of a wake to him in advance. Yet, while Maurice was old enough to acknowledge death, he was too young to believe his mother could die. They didn't speak on the drive home. As they passed between houses, Maurice thought the vacant windows resembled his mother's empty eyes. Maurice hardly breathed, and his father dared not look at him. They moved not long after. That was when Maurice began seeing monsters. Gregory made his living as an event coordinator. He originally focused on local events, mainly weddings. After his wife's death, he began coordinating large-scale festivals and trade shows. This required him to travel across the country. Often he would rent a new house, but never spent enough time there to settle down. As a result, Maurice never formed strong attachments or friendships. However, he saw plenty of monsters. Each new home contained some dark presence, be it a ghoulish face in the bedroom window, a cold spot in the basement, or creaking in the attic. Gregory insisted the claws in the moonlight were only gnarled trees. He told Maurice he saw the silhouettes of cobwebs on the staircase, not ghosts. Their humid cellar contained insects, not demons. That didn't explain the dank smell in the kitchen of their next home. Maurice thought it was a vampire. He warned his father that it must sleep under the sink for lack of a coffin. It bode its time till night, whispered Maurice, when it slunk out to drink their blood. Their latest home was different, though. Even though he saw its photograph, Maurice felt uneasy. The emotion almost did not exist, save for his vaguest contemplation. The fear only appeared when he arrived in person. It was sunset. Gregory stood outside the car. He admired the house from the curb before rushing indoors. Maurice studied every inch. He gazed from the gables to the garden. His eyes found an upstairs window, soon to be his bedroom. There he saw Uncle Scratch, dimly lit from below as the sun melted behind the clouds. His form was visible in the dying light, yet his features remained hidden. Maurice's expression bore no surprise. The boy was experienced at recognizing monsters. They were all worrisome, yet Maurice knew Uncle Scratch would be the worst. Most monsters were eager to reveal their presence. Their hideous faces quickly appeared in his nightmares. That day, Maurice only saw Uncle Scratch's moss-colored eyes. Then he left the windowpane and submerged into darkness. In other ways, Uncle Scratch was like any monster. He appeared at night and resided within the bedroom closet. Maurice took care to keep it spotless. Monsters are less inclined to haunt clean spaces. During the first night, Uncle Scratch's stare confronted him. His mossy eyes betrayed an insatiable hunger. Maurice knew that Uncle Scratch did not care for flesh. He wanted something more, and Maurice feared it was the worst. Maurice owned a nightlight. It was a gift from his mother, and it covered him in other homes. He tried to use it here, but it was disturbing to have a nightlight illuminating Uncle Scratch. Maurice cringed at the sight of the slimy rats. Uncle Scratch's gloved hands stroked them as they writhed. His touch was never gentle. They scurried over his suit, clashing with his unwrinkled tie and spotless white gloves. This cleanliness amplified the rat's repulsiveness. Once a rat attempted to issue a warning. He told Maurice not to accept Uncle Scratch's treats. Before it finished, Uncle Scratch pulled the rat away. He dropped it into his pocket by its tail. Maurice heard it squeal as it disappeared. Then Uncle Scratch spoke to him. His whisper was coaxing, almost friendly. He offered Maurice a treat, but he did not accept. Uncle Scratch left, promising to bring Maurice another surprise tomorrow. Maurice shuddered, for monsters never spoke. They waited until Maurice fell asleep before venturing forward. Walking chased them away. Uncle Scratch could not be frightened so easily. Every night, Maurice heard him beckon. Uncle Scratch proved strenuous for Gregory as well. "Go to bed," he ordered, as they listened to the radio. "But, Daddy, Uncle Scratch will be up there," Maurice sobbed. "He'll show me some candy or a toy. He'll try to get me. Please, Daddy." "It's getting harder to resist him every night. He just won't ever give up." "Your obsession with monsters is tiresome," sighed his father. "It's those pulp magazines you read. If they hadn't belonged to your mother, I'd have burned the lot to ashes." Maurice listened for a moment until the ball game on the radio returned. Gregory turned away to enjoy it. Maurice hated sports. He never understood why his father fussed over them. Sighing, Maurice went upstairs for bed. As he departed, Gregory called after him, "Remember to brush your teeth." After 3 steps, Maurice stopped. He studied the stairs. He wondered about the creaking. In an earlier house, Lady Swoon Moon made similar sounds. He remembered her long teeth. She painted them like candy canes with the blood of children. To Maurice, each creak was the sound of munching. He visualized her crouched over the bones of innocent victims. Maurice quaked in fear. He ran up the stairs and saw the bathroom door. It was a foot from his bedroom. Maurice needed to relieve himself. The bathroom always seemed miles away. He stepped forward and heard a creak. His bedroom door was open, and a rat scurried out. "Don't listen to him, Maurice," it squeaked. "He told me there'd be a dollhouse." The rat never finished. The door opened wider, and Uncle Scratch's hand shot forward. He clutched the rat and dragged it into the bedroom. It screamed in the voice of a young girl. The door shut, and Uncle Scratch's eye materialized in the keyhole. It stared at Maurice lustfully. The boy bolted into the bathroom and slammed the door. He quivered on the toilet for hours. Eventually his eyes shut and he fell asleep. Meanwhile, his closet door opened and Uncle Scratch crept out. Through the bathroom keyhole he studied Maurice. His expression sparkled with anticipation. "Soon," he whispered as his tongue massaged his lips. Gregory had fallen asleep listening to his radio. He awoke suddenly, and his lips parted in fear. He studied his radio vacantly, as reruns of Lights Out was playing. He switched it off, while his free hand fumbled in his pocket for matches. Quivering, he lit his pipe. "Good Lord," he whispered to himself. "What a nightmare." His face sunk as he remembered fragments of his dream. Gloved hands, rats, and mossy eyes. Someone he knew was screaming in that dream, someone young. "I better check on Maurice," he whimpered to himself. He trod up the stairs, through the hallway, and into Maurice's room. "My God!" he exclaimed upon entering. He stood staring, his hand frozen on the doorknob. Toys littered the floor, but Maurice's bed was empty. His face paled. Then he heard snoring from outside. The bathroom light was on, and he sighed with relief. He smiled as he opened the bathroom door and saw him sleeping. "That's my boy," he sighed. His arms sagged with the child's weight as he lifted him. Maurice's eyes fluttered while his father carried him to his bedroom. They half opened as the blanket swished over him before closing once more. Hours later, Maurice awoke. He silently cursed his foolishness and wondered how he got into bed. In the darkness, a noise sounded, yet it was not rats scurrying or children moaning. It was a human voice. Maurice was still corpse-like. The noise broke the silence like ice cracking. Maurice drew a silent breath and listened closer. There was a silence, then a whine. A long sob emerged before the silence returned. Maurice turned his head. The moon outside had disappeared, and the room was black. Another murmur. There was no mistake. Someone was weeping. Was this Uncle Scratch? Maurice had never heard a monster cry, not even as a trick. A wet sound followed like a bucket collecting rain. Maurice visualized tears streaming down a woman's face. Another sob. It was nearer now. The dripping continued, accentuated by occasional moans. The sound was feminine. Maurice remembered his mother, and his eyes watered. He debated turning on his lamp. Uncle Scratch would have offered a treat by now. He reached toward the switch, but stopped. There was a fumbling, then a sob near Maurice's ear. In fact, he drew his hand back, and the noise ceased. Maurice did not lie down. He feared the presence would hear his mattress. In the dark, something slithered. Maurice sensed the presence under his bed. Sweat tickled his chin, but he was too frightened to wipe it away. The voice returned. It wept under the bed in a constant stream. Did it want his attention? Maurice ventured a question. "Why are you crying?" he asked. The sound ceased, and Maurice heard a soft creaking as something crawled out from under the bed. There was silence until a huddled mass formed over the window. "Maurice," the mass whimpered. "Is that you?" Maurice turned pale. It sounded like his mother. Suddenly, a blue light jarred the mass into a straight stance. Maurice saw that it was indeed his mother. The light emanated from wires fastened to her skull. She floated before him like a specter. Maurice tilted his head and noticed Uncle Scratch illuminated in the corner. His mossy eyes stared at his mother viciously. After several jolts, she floated limply in the air. Uncle Scratch lifted a hammer and an ice pick for Maurice to see. Casually, he strode nearer while Maurice watched helplessly. Floundering electric sparks from the wires occasionally tore through the darkness. In these moments, Maurice watched Uncle Scratch set the hammer down on his bedside table. Uncle Scratch pulled back his mother's left eyelid. Slowly, he inserted the ice pick over the top of her eyeball. He carefully slid it deeper until it hit bone. He retrieved his hammer, and with 2 taps, he broke through the thin layer of skull. Maurice observed Uncle Scratch scraping behind it. Another 2 taps and more scraping behind the other eyeball, and Uncle Scratch discarded his tools. He turned back to Maurice. "That's what they did to her, Maurice." Uncle Scratch whispered. "They didn't even bother to get a doctor to do it, just some staff member. Then they turned her loose, and she took a tumble down the stairs. We both know how that turned out, don't we?" The blue crackles died with the last of Uncle Scratch's words. Maurice sat in thick darkness. He groped back in bed when he heard Uncle Scratch's sinister voice in the blackness. "I can bring her back, Maurice," he said. "There will be a price, but nothing worthwhile is ever free. Just say yes." The sound of rats scuttling behind the walls appeared. A mixture of fear and loneliness consumed Maurice. He wondered if Uncle Scratch could restore his mother. If so, what would remain of her? There was hardly a sound when Maurice whispered, "Yes." In a flash, the room was empty. Maurice turned on his light and checked under his bed for his mother. He found her sprawled on the floor, gibbering mindlessly. Maurice crawled under the bed and lay with her. He wept and stroked her hair. They exchanged a horrified glance. She opened her mouth to speak, but only drool dripped out. Uncle Scratch had restored her flesh, but her mind was another matter. Moments later, Uncle Scratch's hand snuck under the bed and pulled Maurice away. He locked him in the closet where he was alone with the rats. Uncle Scratch forbade him from calling to his mother, and then whispered, "It's time to pay the price I mentioned." When a child disappears, questioning the parents is routine police work. The officers escorted Gregory from his home. From the car, he had one glance at the house. He looked upwards and gazed at the window to Maurice's bedroom. Before the police car departed, he saw a rat on the windowsill. For some reason, the sight disturbed him. It was just as well that his hearing was only average. Had he keen ears, he would have heard a voice squealing, "Daddy, help me, please, Daddy."
"12 years ago, I lived in a small town called Fenter. It was a quiet place to grow up, with one school, a doctor's office, a police station, a couple of restaurants, and a host of local shops on the west side. We even had a theater, with films shown a month after the national release date. Over on the east side of town was the residential area, with about 40 houses, the town bar, and the woods that spanned an area of about 20 square miles. Although I'd grown up playing in Fenter woods, it was still easy to get lost in them. My father used to tell my friends and I to never go past the creek that ran through about a mile in from the road. Still, this gave us plenty of space to play, and we spent many summers building forts and playing hide-and-seek amongst the tall trees. One late summer evening, my friend Jess and I were out near the creek trying to sneak up on the rabbits that inhabited the woods, getting as close as we could before they'd notice and run away. I spent about 10 minutes searching for one, and in my eagerness, I left Jess behind. She'd stopped to examine some oddly shaped rocks, and being impatient, I'd told her to catch up with me when she was finished. I just reached the hill where the creek bent and curved around to travel north for another 3 miles, when I spied a rabbit chewing on some leaves near an oak tree. I held my breath, grabbing my jacket to stop it from flapping in the breeze, and began slowly inching toward it. I was careful to avoid stepping on any twigs. If one snapped underfoot, I'd be busted. With the sun going down, it was likely the last chance I had at the game before I'd have to head home for dinner. The rabbit was blissfully unaware of my presence. Its brown coat was tinged orange by the setting sun, and its ears flopped down like a hunter's hat. The irony didn't escape me as I crept up on it, silent as the leaves floating in the breeze. I smirked. I was just over 3 yards away from it, and it still hadn't noticed me. So far, so good. I slowed my pace even more. I didn't want to make a rookie mistake in my excitement and ruin the opportunity. The rabbit finished its leaf and casually began sniffing the next one before digging in. Less than 7 feet away now, the closest I'd ever gotten. I felt my heart beat in my chest, and for a second, I was scared the rabbit would hear it thudding against my ribcage and dart off. I shook my head and continued up behind it. It was almost within arm's reach. I couldn't believe it. I stretched out my arm, fingers extended. Wait till Jess hears about this, I thought. I'd be the first kid in town to have touched a forest rabbit. My hand was about a foot from brushing its soft pelt. I could see each individual hair on its back, less than a foot away. I'd done it. I'd done it. Suddenly, an ear-splitting scream pierced the air, shattering the silence of the woods and sending the resting birds into a panic, scattering them from the trees. I gasped, and quick as a flash, the rabbit was under the brush and gone forever. I cursed aloud and spat. Damn it! Damn! Damn! Frustration clouding my head. It was a good few seconds before I even stopped to consider where the scream had come from. Then, like a falling tree, it hit me. Jess. I sprinted back up the creek as fast as I could. She'd been about 200 yards back when I'd last seen her, near the old silver birches. It took me about 2 minutes to reach the pile of rocks where we had parted ways. My brow was covered in sweat and my hair was a mess where the wind had whipped through it. But all I could think about was finding Jess. Even though I told myself that the woods were perfectly safe, I cursed myself for having left her alone. I spun around in a circle, scanning for any sign of her, but there was none.
Jess!
I yelled, my voice traveling through the woods and echoing off the trees. It was getting darker, and tall shadows were being cast all around me, like an unearthly net.
Jess, where are you? Call out to me, Jess!
I stood and listened, but there was no reply. I was just about to run further up the creek to where the trail began, thinking that perhaps she had started to make her way back toward home. And then I saw it. It stood on the other side of the creek, about 50 yards away. It was as tall as the lowest branches of the sycamore, which I reckoned to be about 7 feet off the ground. It was covered in black rags, ripped and torn across its thin, wiry body. A hood pulled tightly around its head obscured most of its features. Still, I could make out 2 white, pupilless eyes staring at me from the shadowed recess. I spied the flash of teeth, long, slender arms with hook-like fingers splaying out from stumped hands, almost dragged against the ground by its sides. I suddenly noticed an overpowering stench and wondered how I'd failed to notice it sooner. I'd smelt it before on the farms when the cattle were harvested in the slaughterhouses. It was the smell of death, thick and despairing. I almost choked, but my mouth wouldn't make a sound. I just kept staring at it, petrified, blood running cold through my veins. Even the birds stopped screeching in protest. Now there was nothing but silence. The creature and I stood on opposite sides of the creek, locked in a gaze that I'm certain I will remember until the day I die. I don't know how long I stood like that. It felt like minutes, but it was probably only a few seconds. Suddenly, it shifted its weight and hunched down. For a moment, I thought it was going to start running at me, and I almost threw up, uncontrollable fear racking my body. Then I realized that it had stooped to collect something from the ground. I cried out silently. It was Jess. Her limp body looked like a doll next to the creature's freakishly proportioned frame. Despite its thin and stick-like body, it easily picked her up with one bony hand, fingers clasped around her waist, teeth bared in a crooked, humorless smile. It opened up part of its shawl and pulled her close against its blackened torso. I caught glimpses of her ribcage and rotten flesh. I reached out my arm as if I could somehow pull her back to me, but in my heart, I knew it was too late. The creature turned and started to stride off, heading deeper into the forest. Even if I had known that area of the woods and had possessed the strength to move my legs, I never could have caught up to it. Before I knew it, the creature had disappeared from sight, as if it had never been there at all. Only the heavy smell of decay was left lingering in the air. The only evidence that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I snapped my head around and began to run back towards town. It was a good mile away, and I'd never run that far before. But that day I ran and didn't stop, jumping over fallen logs and ducking branches. I dared not look back. The darkness was nearly total by the time I burst from the undergrowth at the edge of town. I sprinted to the nearby bar and surged through the door, practically collapsing onto the floor. I don't really remember what happened next. From what I was told later on, it took everyone there about 10 minutes to stop me from screaming about the demon I'd seen in the woods and that we had to find Jess. By the time they actually got the story out of me and organized a search party, 2 hours had passed. Jess's dad shook me and shouted at me, asking me over and over what had happened to his baby girl. I could only stare at him, dumbfounded and mute, until my own father dragged him off and told him to get a grip. The sheriff organized the townsfolk into 2 groups and assigned each group a section of the woods to search. I begged my father to stay, but he told me to calm down, that I was in shock and talking nonsense, my mind making up stories to try and make sense of what happened. He sent me home to rest under the watchful eye of my mother as he led one of the groups into the woods. 3 hours passed. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, huddled in my blankets, paranoid of every shadow and creak. I was convinced that it, the nightmare, was going to come back for me, the only witness to its abomination. Then I heard the front door open and the heavy footsteps of men entering the living room downstairs. I listened as they sat down and began to talk. "Damnedest thing I ever seen in my life, Jiry. I don't know what's out there, but it sure riled up the dogs." I could tell that it was the sheriff speaking. "What was it? A bear? Do you think, Sheriff?" I didn't know who was speaking, but he sounded young. Maybe one of the farmhands. "Maybe. All I know is that 2 of my best tracker hounds caught a scent and started going mad. They tore off into the woods faster than I've ever seen them run, and they didn't come back. Jesus, now we're down 2 dogs and a little girl." Then I heard my dad's voice. I eased up a little bit. Knowing he was back in the house made me feel safer. "Chris said he found the poor girl's gloves down by the creek, right where my boys said they were playing." The unknown voice, presumably Chris, came again. "It's true. They were covered in some kind of slime or something. Don't know what, but it smelled god-awful. One of the boys almost upped his liquor." "Okay, well, at least we know she was there. I'm not hoping for much, but I'll pray. It's one big forest, and the chances of finding her are mighty slim." The sheriff sighed. "I suppose I'd better go tell the family that they should prepare themselves for the worst. Damn, no man should have to outlive his kid in this brutal uncertainty." "Didn't Travis say he saw something big moving through the forest?" asked another voice. The sheriff responded. "Yeah, he radioed in. Said he saw some kind of, giant moving in the distance. But he's liquored up, and it's dark as the bottom of a well out there. He was probably just jumping at shadows. No, most likely a bear or a wolf or something jumped her from behind and dragged her off." My father spoke again now, voice raised so everyone could hear. "Okay, let's all go home. It's been a tough night, and there's not much more we can do in the dark. We'll search again tomorrow. Even if it's only a body we find, that's still better than our poor folks not knowing what happened. I want everyone to tell their kids not to go in the forest anymore till we know for certain what happened. Understood?" There were murmurs of agreement followed by solemn goodbyes The men left, and I heard the front door lock shut behind them. My father moved about the main floor for a few minutes before climbing the stairs and going to bed. Before he turned in, he poked his head into my room to check that I was okay. I pretended to be asleep. I had nothing to say. I didn't even know what to tell myself. But one thing I knew for certain, I hadn't been hallucinating. I'd really seen it. And whatever it was, it had Jess. I waited for half an hour after I heard my dad climb into his bed before I sat up and switched on my bedside light. I crept out of bed and got dressed as quietly as I could before descending the stairs. My father had taught me how to shoot and maintain a gun a few years back. It was important knowledge to have out in the country. Hunting was a tradition amongst the men, and when I was old enough, my father would take me camping in the woods to trap and shoot game like his father before him. I knew the spot in the garage where my dad kept his .44 Magnum and rounds. After searching around for a few minutes, I found the key to the lockbox. I opened it, loaded the pistol, and grabbed a flashlight before leaving the house and locking the door behind me. The chilly nighttime air enveloped me and turned my breath to fog. I looked at the forest, once a place of fun and laughter, now dark and sinister in the moonlight. The twisted branches of its many trees stretching towards the sky like skeletal fingers. I swallowed my fear. That thing had Jess, and I intended to do everything I could to get her back. After all, it was my fault for leaving her alone out there. I ignored the lump in my throat and I walked determinedly down the road toward the woods. Don't worry, Jess, I thought. I'm coming. As I entered the woods, I immediately began to second-guess myself. I knew that what I was doing was not a sound decision by any definition, and I knew that my foolhardiness could very well get me killed. The thought of bumping into the creature out there, alone in the dark, was more terrifying than I can even describe. Knowing that Jess was in that exact situation herself drove me on. I trudged the familiar old trail for about 20 minutes until I came to the creek. I had never been there in the dark before. Although everything was where it should be, it looked different. Under cover of night, it was an alien place. The creature's domain. And I was an unwelcome stranger. I had no idea what lay beyond the creek, save for what I'd seen in the immediate area earlier that day. Carefully, I crossed the creek, the water soaking through my boots and dampening my trouser legs. As soon as I stepped over to the other side, I felt like I was lost. How could I get back? Which direction would I go? I ignored the first question. I had bigger things to worry about and decided to head off in the direction I'd last seen the creature going. I started walking, vigilant for any signs of movement or noise. I'd expected there to be animals out this late at night, but it was eerily silent. In my vulnerable state, every crackling footstep sounded to me like an alarm, alerting the creature to my presence. I stopped for a moment and looked around with my flashlight. I felt like the darkness was swallowing me. That the thing must be sitting just outside the borders of my light, laughing at my efforts to find it. I realized that if there was anything out there, the light would only serve to give away my position, effectively negating any kind of advantage I might have. After a pause, I switched off the flashlight and waited for my eyes to adjust. It was difficult at first, but after a few minutes, I could make out enough of the forest to slowly make my way through. About 10 minutes passed before I heard it. A short, sharp yelp to my left, somewhere in the distance. I paused and waited, listening intently for any other noise. A moment later, a snap echoed through the forest, followed by a dull thump. I was not alone anymore. I crouched down and slowly made my way towards the noise. My experiencing sneaking up on rabbits proved essential as I crept stealthily through the dark, distributing my weight carefully so as to remain quiet. After a while, I reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a grassy patch about half the size of a football field. In the center of the clearing was a rocky depression that sunk down into the earth. I was about to make my way over and investigate when the creature reappeared. It was near the edge of the clearing to the south and was slowly limping its way over to the depression, dragging something behind it. In the darkness, I couldn't make out what it was pulling, but it appeared to be the size of a child, and it had been snapped in the middle. My stomach turned as I watched the creature's conquest flap limply with the bounce of each step it took. Tears stung my eyes. I swallowed hard. Sorrow and fear swirled within me, impossibly entangled. I prayed to God to not let it be Jess, and continued to watch as the thing reached the pit and hurled the object it carried over the rim. It hit the ground with the unmistakable sound of crunching bone. The creature bent down headfirst as if to crawl down the rocks, and then it stopped. Slowly, it stood back up and sniffed. I instinctively pressed my back to a tree, removing myself from view, and strained to listen. I heard it sniff again softly and walk around in what sounded like a small circle, and then nothing. I waited for what seemed like eternity. I waited. I was unbearably tense, expecting to see its milky eyes slowly peer round the side of the tree at any second, or to feel a long, hooked finger slide out of the darkness and fall on my shoulder. But nothing happened immediately. Several minutes later, I was still waiting. Gathering my courage, I hesitantly glanced around the trunk, only to see that the clearing was empty. I double, triple, and quadruple checked the area, sweeping my eyes across every inch of the terrain, making deadly sure the creature was gone. Only then did I step back out to the edge of the clearing, keeping low to the ground. Stepping into the center of an open area was out of the question, suicidal even. What if it was only hiding near the outskirts of the clearing or waiting in the rocky fissure at the center? The notion went against every survival instinct I had, and yet I had to know. I had come looking for Jess. If I turned back without checking to see whether it was her, crumpled and broken at the bottom of those rocks, I might never know. The sheriff was right. Not knowing was the worst part. Before I stepped out, I pulled the gun out of my waistband and cocked the hammer back, being careful to mute the click by smothering it between my legs. When it was loaded and ready to fire, I began to slowly inch my way away from the safety of the tree line out into the open. I took a few steps and stopped, waiting to see if anything came crashing towards me. When nothing did, I continued my cautious journey to the depression. When I reached the lip, I aimed the gun ahead of me, steeled myself, and slowly looked over. It was about 10 feet to the bottom, and its circumference was a little larger than I had expected. One side of the hole was hollow and extended into the ground as a sort of cave, large enough to drive a car through. At the mouth of the cave was the body, slumped over a jagged rock. I glanced around again to ensure nothing was creeping up on me, and then began to lower myself down. I would just need a quick glance to make sure it wasn't, or God forbid, was, Jess. And then I'd leave and run back to Fenter. I'd wake my dad and the others and lead them to the cave. And then we'd kill it. At that moment, it occurred to me that the thing might still be in the cave, watching and waiting. Perhaps it watched me struggle down the rock. But if it was in the cave, I reasoned, there was nothing I could do about it. I must be crazy, I thought to myself. I was so afraid that I couldn't feel anything anymore. I continued my descent and remained on high alert, watching for any sign of the creature. No sooner did I confirm that it was in fact gone, when I promptly slipped and fell off the side of the rock, landing awkwardly and sending pain shooting through my ankle. I nearly cursed aloud but bit down on my lip and shouted silently in my head. Luckily, a quick self-assessment confirmed that nothing was broken or sprained, just aching. I was able to walk on it without a problem. Thank goodness. The last thing I needed was a broken foot. My thoughts had been so preoccupied with the sudden pain that I had momentarily forgotten where I was. Right next to the cadaver. My leg bumped against it and I spun around, gun at the ready, almost firing it off into the rocks. I quickly berated myself from my itchy trigger finger and looked down. Relief and repulsion washed over me. I could see clearly that it wasn't Jess. In fact, it wasn't even human. Rather, it was the remains of a large dog. One of the sheriff's hounds that had gone missing earlier. Its back was snapped in two and folded in on itself. Its snout was crumbled back into its face, turning it into a flat, tooth-filled gap. Blood, fur, bone, and brain were splattered over it, and one eye hung loosely from its socket. I felt like it was staring right at me. I looked away and felt bile rising in my throat. The smell of death and decay near the cave was overpowering. I dreaded to think about who or what else might be nestled inside. I was about to begin scrambling back up the edge of the depression when I heard a sob. I spun around and stared into the darkness of the cave. It sounded faint, as if it had come from a long way away, echoing through narrow rock passages until it eventually succeeded in finding its way to the surface. It came again. Having heard it twice, there was no mistaking it. It was the sound of a child crying. The first thoughts rushing through my head were ones of joy. She was alive! It had to be Jess, hidden away deep in the creature's lair. No sooner had the thought crossed my mind when I realized, with a fear unlike any I had ever known, that I would have to go into the cave to get her. I had no choice. I couldn't turn back. Living with the guilt would be far worse than anything that might befall me if I entered the cave. Readying my gun, I pulled out the flashlight and switched it on. The beam stung my eyes for a few seconds as they adjusted to the sudden change in brightness. But I could soon see that the cave went on for a few yards before widening into a large rocky chamber with passages of varying sizes leading further underground. I entered the mouth of the cave and shone the light over the walls and floor. The beam danced over bones scattered across the ground. It looked as if every type of animal in the forest had eventually wound up in the creature's lair, torn apart and stripped of flesh. I covered my mouth and nose with the sleeve of my gun hand and continued to walk. I saw 4 passages. The sobbing appeared to be coming from the one furthest to my left. Thankfully, it was one of the wider passages, and I found I could comfortably walk through it with enough room to stand up straight. I struggled to suppress the impulse to run and hide while I still had a chance to save myself. I realized that if the creature came from the mouth of the cave, then and there I would be trapped. If it was already in the cave, I was walking straight into its spindly, disproportionate arms. I swallowed hard and continued to walk. After a couple of yards, the tunnel turned right sharply and opened up into a small version of the chamber from which I had just come. I had stumbled upon a bizarre museum of personal trinkets. Watches, jewelry, passports, letters, glasses, clothes, books, wallets, countless things with unspoken sentimental value. I picked up one of the passports and opened it. Paul Ashcroft, born 1972, Herronford, Ohio. Another read Richard Blunt, born 1954, Westville, California. I shone the light over the letters, noting that the addresses were from places all over the country. Then it dawned on me. I finally understood. It all made sense. The reason I had never seen this thing in the woods before was because it had only recently arrived. It must have traveled from place to place, from forest to national park to desert to mountain, picking people off, taking their effects, before it moved on to the next town. It was like a sick scavenger hunt, the way it killed people and kept their belongings as souvenirs. Another sob brought me back to reality, and I dropped the passport to the ground. I hurriedly moved to the back of the chamber and found another short passage. This opened into a medium-sized cavern, inside of which I saw Jess, sitting on the floor crying. She looked up and shielded her eyes when my light shone over her. Please, let me... She sobbed, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. I stood a moment dumbfounded as I realized that I had been so focused on finding Jess that I hadn't planned an escape. I didn't know quite what to do. Thinking quickly, I decided I had better let her know it was me before deciding on anything. I shone the light upwards, illuminating my face as I moved toward her. Jess stopped sobbing and stared. Jess, I whispered and knelt beside her. I've come to rescue you, but we don't have much time. We need to go now before that thing comes back. She remained motionless for a moment, and then threw her arms around me, her body shaking. I thought I was going to die down here. I thought it was going to eat me like it did the rest. I don't. She trailed off, unable to get her words out through the tears. I squeezed her back for a moment and then went to lift her. The sudden sound of metal clanging against rock reverberated through the cave. I shone the light down and my heart sank. She was chained to a heavy metal ring pin that had been nailed deep into the rocks beside her. I couldn't escape. She sniffed. I tried to pull it out, but it's no use. I stood for a second, dejected. I could go get help. Come back. No! She squeaked. Please don't leave me here. Panic spread across her face, and in that moment I knew all I could do was promise not to leave. I thought for a few moments and then, realizing my only option, took her chin and looked her in the eye. Jess, I have a gun. I'm going to have to shoot the chain to set you free. It's going to be very loud, and the noise will probably attract the thing here. She said nothing, but looked at me, waiting for me to continue. "As soon as it's broken," I went on, "we're going to have to run for the cave entrance and back through the woods." She looked thoughtful for a moment and then took my chin and nodded, and then she kissed me. I blushed. Here we were, sitting below ground in a monster's cave, and I was blushing. I almost laughed and smiled back at her. I took a moment to regain my composure and then aimed my gun at the chain. "Cover your ears, okay? I'll do it on 3. 1, 2. A guttural moan sounded from the mouth of the cave and echoed down the passage as to where we were. I looked at Jess just in time to see the color drain from her face and felt it drain from my own. It was back. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The gun cracked, its sound deafening in such a small place, and the chain shattered. I grabbed Jess before she could react and pulled her up, sprinting towards the makeshift museum behind us. As we entered the chamber, I dove behind a table full of bric-a-brac and pulled her down with me. No sooner had we landed on the floor than I saw the creature enter the room and scramble over the passage from which we had come. As soon as it was gone from sight, I pulled Jess back to her feet and pushed her in the direction of the entrance to the cave. She didn't need any convincing. Together we ran as fast as our legs could carry us. As the mouth of the cave came into view, a rage-filled scream rang out behind us as the creature discovered its meal was gone. As Jess and I reached our exit point, I could hear wood splintering and the crash of dozens of tiny objects hitting stones as the beast tore through the museum after us. I grabbed Jess's foot and hoisted her up so that she could grab the lip of the fissure and pull herself into the clearing. I spun around and then saw it exit the passage into the main chamber. Its hood had fallen down to expose its inhuman face. I fired a shot in its direction and it screeched in agony as the bullet connected with its upper leg, knocking it back for a second. Taking advantage of the spare moment, I spun back around, leapt for the edge, and grabbed hold. Jess seized me by the collar and helped pull me up just as hooked fingers brushed the bottom of my shoe. We started to run across the clearing and realized it was morning. In the east, the sun peeked over the horizon, casting a slight glow over the woods and turning the sky a pinkish red. We ran for miles. For hours. The whole while, I could hear Jess's captor crashing through the trees after us. If my bullet hadn't connected, I doubt we would have stood a chance of outrunning it. But somehow, whether by luck or fate, we survived. We reached the creek 45 minutes later. By the time we saw the edge of the woods, we had run, fueled by adrenaline, for over an hour. When we reached Fenter, I fired the gun into the air and collapsed, shaking violently. Within a couple of minutes, a crowd of alarmed townspeople had surrounded us, some asking what had happened, others grabbing and hugging Jess, and most just staring blankly in confusion at the commotion. When Jess's father arrived, he broke down and cried, holding his daughter to his chest and thanking God and me equally for her safe return. When my father arrived, he took the gun from me, put his hand on my shoulder, and gave me a look. It was a look that said he didn't care what had happened. He was just glad I was home and in one piece. We gave a statement to the sheriff. Afterwards, a group was organized and armed. I was asked to lead my dad, the sheriff, and roughly 20 other men to the cave. I was tired and reluctant to go back, but the light of day made me braver, and there, beside my dad, I felt safe. After a couple of hours, we came across the clearing and found the cave system just as Jess and I had described. The museum was empty. We found the shattered chain untouched where we had left it. A brief examination of the other caves revealed skeletons, later identified as other missing persons from the towns that bordered Fenter. Forensics later proved that the victims had been dead for some time. We searched the woods until sunset, but found no sign of the creature or which way it might have gone. That night, as I looked out my window before going to sleep, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods. It looked at me through my window for a while. I stared back, just like during our first encounter. Then it turned and walked back into the woods. I never saw the creature again. I figured it moved on to another place, away from Fenter. The townsfolk searched for another week, but no further traces of the creature were found. Official reports say that people had been kidnapped, most of them killed, by a maniac, who then evaded capture and escaped into the wilderness. But off the record, the people of Fenter believed Jess. They believed me. These days, the events are a distant memory. Everyone has moved on. Jess attended an out-of-state college and graduated with honors, and is now an animal rights lawyer. I relocated some 30 miles from Fenter and got into farming. Then I met someone and got married and raised a family. But I'll never forget what happened to Jess and I in Fenter Woods. Whenever I go camping or hiking or set foot on a trail, I'm reminded it's still out there. Who knows? It might just be in your town by now.
Randall was a man who was growing tired of a great many things. He was tired of his job, of his tiny apartment, of the depressed little city that the two resided in, as well as his failing car, failing relationships, and the sputtering gasps of his dreams and ambitions. As he sat outside in the back of the small restaurant in which he worked as a cook, he inhaled the rancid smoke of his cheap cigarette and sighed as the cloud escaped his lungs. His eyes meandered along the corners and edges of the rear service entrance he had exited through, and the building itself, which it led back into. It seemed as though everything from the door and the building before him, up through the contents of his own life, were all in some state of crumbling decay, either metaphorically, or in the case of the restaurant's rear exterior, quite literally. He knew that inside the burners upon the ovens, as well as those upon the grills, were shoddy and distributed flame unevenly due to their age and corrosion. He knew that the coolers were failing, and that the produce rotations and the questionable increase in adding mystery soup specials to the menus meant simply that management saw the borderline food products they were selling to be a more economical solution than replacing the broken down equipment. He knew that after work these senses of a breaking down world would continue to pester him. Were he even to receive a call from Julie, a woman he had been dating casually yet growing further apart from, it would undoubtedly result in an awkward conversation about plans they may or may not carry through on, leading to an unsurprising dullness if they did, and a furthering divide between them if they did not. As for friends, though he could not specifically put his finger on when such began, it seemed increasingly as though he never spoke to any, or that those few who he could think of had moved on and away some long time ago. Through and through these feelings that the entire universe was in a slow process of decay dogged him from the moment he woke up to whatever times he finally fell asleep. And though he would from time to time attempt to discuss this sense of entropy that he felt, it seemed quite clear, following multiple discussions with co-workers or strangers at the bar, or really anyone who would listen, that he was alone in feeling or observing such. As though it was solely his universe which was falling apart. As he let this sensation linger a moment longer, he stubbed his cigarette on the gritty concrete below, rose from his seat on the ground and walked back into work, closing the door behind him. No sooner had it latched with him safely inside than did a chunk of concrete break loose from the frame above and fall crashing to the ground. Though his sense of decay in his personal life was certainly a subjective matter, observations about his workplace were facts more solid than the brick, mortar, or concrete which comprised it. The same was true for his home. Stepping around a cracked and crumbling portion of the concrete outer step upon returning home from work, he struggled as he usually did with the key and front door, neither of which seemed too keen to work with the other to allow him entry. As the stairs within his apartment in the front stairwell creaked and groaned as he traversed the 2 flights upwards to his tiny apartment, he wondered how long it would be until one of his feet finally went through one. The lights flickered as he turned them on, now finally home, and the undeniable yet unidentifiable stench of something foul and rotting once again seemed to have made its way into his abode, either through the aging pipes or perhaps something merely dead and decomposing in either the ceiling or floor below his feet. There was a singular bright spot in the midst of such dilapidation, if one could even call it a bright spot, which he struggled with internally from time to time. As his social life and social circles degraded into nothing, he had taken up drinking alone as something of a hobby. Not of the classic sort, wherein a man with a whiskey bottle stares blankly into space, wondering what had become of his life. Randall had recently discovered that so long as he cut through the right sequence of alleyways, he could walk downtown in relatively short time. Upon arriving, he would set about bar hopping, sipping cheap well drinks, and preparing to enjoy the social messes that would evolve following last call. Generally good and drunk by the time this would happen, the shouting matches, tearful makeup sessions, fist fights, and barroom romances, which would spill out into the street, provided for Randall a source of short-lived entertainment on most nights. It was, however, on one particular night that his usual route from whiskey bar to tap house to whiskey bar again found itself interrupted by a sight that was unusual in Randall's routine. Walking off of one of the side streets which led to the main drag, he caught nearly immediate sight of an exceptionally beautiful woman. Unlike most others he'd see in town, she lacked the destroyed complexion, the paleness or paltry tones, and generally trashy demeanor which nearly every other woman he'd encountered in town seemed to wear these days. Instead, across the street and staring directly at him was a woman of stunning composure and aesthetic, with fine black hair, a healthy and flawless complexion, and illustrious green eyes. She wore a slinky blue dress which hugged her hips and shoulders and breasts perfectly, outlining a body fit for a Hollywood starlet. He was forced to stop dead in his tracks upon meeting eyes with her from across the boulevard. In what seemed to last both a split second and eternity, the two stood looking at one another with Randall's face awash in stunned surprise at the sight of such a beauty, and her expression being one of a knowing playfulness. As the moment then passed, she turned and walked into the front door of a nightclub he had never bothered to notice before. Just as she passed through the door, she shot a beckoning look over her shoulder directly at him, to which he found himself drawn irresistibly. Making his way across the street, he shot out directly for the door and stepped inside. Within lay a casual yet sophisticated lounge, with fine furnishings and an overall handsome clientele. He was struck by the generally polished and well-kept environment, which seemed to almost defy his entire understanding of the world and city he inhabited. Nowhere was there to be found any cracked windows or walls, nor furniture, fixture, or lighting that was showing any signs of wear or decay. To all of his senses, a wholeness of construction and composition was found, with everything from the soft sounds of polite conversation and background lounge jazz to the sense of perfumes, fine meals, and exotic cocktails permeating every corner of the place. And as though by some spectacular design, at what seemed to Randall to be at the center of it all, there at the bar, unaccompanied, sat his mystery woman. Sipping daintily on a drink of green as resplendent as her eyes, she glanced over to him from over her shoulder before returning her gaze once again to the glass below. Bewildered and bewitched, Randall made his way to her and took a seat beside her at the bar. He began, trying not to stumble too hard on words which simply wouldn't come. "It's nice to see you again, Randall," said the woman, still focused upon her drink. He was, to put it mildly, dumbstruck, and it began furiously pouring through his mind, trying to recall the apparently forgotten time he'd met this beauty before him. "I know you're struggling to recall who I am, so I suppose I'll introduce myself once again. I am Memory." This time she set her drink down as she spoke and looked Randall dead in the eye. "So we know each other?" he asked in utter bewilderment. She offered him a sincere and friendly laugh. "We do. We've actually met a few times." I'm sorry," he stammered. "I really can't imagine what would cause me to forget someone like you." "You most likely just had a lot on your mind since then. Sometimes people can forget things, so they can keep enough room in their minds to keep things running smoothly." He was entirely baffled by her answer, and continued searching through every mental nook and cranny he could find in a desperate bid to recall their meeting, though try as he might, nothing came. "I think I might have been a blonde last time, to be honest," she said, again returning to her drink but maintaining eye contact as she did. Her suggestion did nothing to help him recollect, and instead only served to drive him ever so slightly madder for his forgetfulness. He was about to speak then, and offer up some paltry apology while then seeking to divert the conversation to more friendly and possibly flirtatious places, when she suddenly asked him a rather strange question. "Randall, are you familiar with the concept of solipsism?" He was again baffled, this time at both the sudden pivot in their discussion, as well as by the vain attempt on his own part to recall the meaning of a word he knew he had learned, once before at least, but could not define. Wordlessly, he shook his head. "It's the idea that in life you can never actually know for certain if anyone else is real, as you only actually have your own experience and perspective to draw upon." She sipped her cocktail again. "The thinking being that since I am and will always only ever be me, and you are and will only ever be you, that neither of us will ever be able to be 100% certain that the other is real in the same way that we are. What do you think of that?" He had not been prepared for a philosophical discussion with such a beautiful woman, let alone seemingly any discussion at all. However, thinking on it for a moment, he soon responded as best as he could. "Well, I know for my part that today I got up, went to work, came home, and then came out here. So my day certainly happened. And looking at you now, I can see that you clearly took some time picking out that gorgeous dress, and applying your makeup and fixing your hair, so you're at least offering me some evidence that you were existing and doing things before we met each other here. So I'd say the odds are rather good we're both very real, right? Memory smiled warmly. That's the spirit. She turned quickly to motion to the bartender, whose attention it seemed as though she already had, either by luck or something else. A moment later, as she was once again facing Randall and smiling a smile that simply melted him through and through, the barkeep arrived at their seats and placed 2 shots of what looked like pale whiskey on the bar. Nodding silently then, he took his leave, and Memory picked up the 2 glasses. Handing one to Randall, she raised her own in something of a toast. Drink up. It's West Cork, your favorite. How did you... he began, but found himself cut off as she motioned for him to follow suit. Raising his own glass, the 2 toasted and shot their whiskey. It went down incredibly smooth, and though he could not recall ever having had that brand of what was clearly Irish whiskey, he found without a doubt or reservation that it was in fact his favorite. His confusion deepened and deepened even more as he watched Memory rise from her seat and gesture for him to do the same. He quickly complied, and his beautiful companion then, with a look of genuine happiness and sincerity, took his hands in her own. It was very, very good to see you again, Randall. It always is. What do you mean it? Again, Randall found his words cut short. This time, it was due to Memory leaning in and kissing him deeply. He closed his eyes. The softness of her lips and the silky smoothness of her skin was complemented so fully by her illustrious and somewhat exotic scent that all thought left Randall in that moment, which seemed to stretch out endlessly and then end abruptly all too soon. He had heard and read of kisses which made the earth seem to shake and quiver. However, as Memory withdrew and his eyes began to open, he caught only the briefest glimpse of her face before the lights flickered and went out. Her hands left his, and the ground felt as though it literally rumbled as they did. Then suddenly, in the dark, Randall felt an overwhelming sense that he was alone. Before he could speak and call to her in the dark, lights flickered and came on once again. However, now instead of the soft lighting of the jazzy, ritzy lounge he had just been standing in, Randall stood instead beneath the stark and harsh fluorescent lights of an empty and dilapidated concrete room. All sounds of music and conversation were replaced by the industrial buzz of the ceiling-mounted lighting, and periodically, the echoing sound of his feet scraping along the concrete floor as he looked all about in absolute shock. For the briefest of moments, Randall was worried that he had gone mad. When the lights themselves began to flicker once more and go out, this time in sequence from the far end of the room, this worry became a sense of abject terror, which caused him to turn sharply on his heel and bolt for what was now a cracked glass and metal shop door leading back out into the street. With every step he took, the darkness felt closer, and though he could not explain why, the very concept of such creeping darkness filled him with an indescribable sense of dread. He needed to make it out. As his hand fell upon the push bar of the disused shop door, he found it locked and scrambled then to turn the small latch handle. Though he heard the bolt fall away, the door would not budge, and the darkness was nearly upon him. From the back of the large empty room, he heard what sounded to him like something massive and heavy collapsing, thunderously in the dark. His terror deepened then, and as the falling blackness raced closer to him, he threw his shoulder into the door, shattering some bits of glass out of it, which went spilling into the ground outside. Thankfully, though, it proved enough to dislodge the frame and allow Randall to escape out into the sidewalk. No sooner had he dashed out into the sidewalk, throwing closed the now partially broken glass door behind him, Then did the same rumble and thunder which had been heard in the shadows before seem to rush up from the back of the room, growing louder from behind the door as it did. Randall stepped back, terrified as the sound reached a crescendo, and from the broken bits of window spewed a merciless cloud of dust, as though a bomb had gone off inside. Standing there, afraid to his very core, and now covered in concrete dust, he looked stupefied at the sight which greeted him as the dust slowly cleared. No longer a polished pub exterior as it had been when he walked in, Randall saw instead a darkened and condemned storefront, which looked as though it had been empty and abandoned for years potentially. Within the storefront windows, which were themselves covered in municipal signage declaring the property private, as well as tape covering vast webs of cracks, he watched as the gray dust that had chased him out swirled about. All about him to either side, dumbfounded gawkers and onlookers stared at the terrified, dust-covered man. One spoke up. "Dude, were you in there?" a young man asked, astonished at the sight of him. Then another spoke as well. "Are you crazy? Buddy, that place has been condemned and slated for demolition for months now," said an older, gruffer onlooker with a husky voice. Randall tried to speak, but could not find the words. The shock and horror of such an impossible experience as he had just been through had rattled him too deeply to speak. He stumbled back a few steps, alternating his gaze between the abandoned shop front and the bystanders who looked at him with equal astonishment and confusion. It was upon his third time looking to the others that another sudden horror presented itself. He could not be sure, for he bolted once more as soon as he saw, but upon looking once more to the strangers which surrounded him, their expressions had changed from the ordinary confusions of people unsure of what had happened, to the dead and expressionless looks which kept attention trained on him despite no longer having eyes to see. They looked more like dead things then, all gazing from empty eye sockets, their pale faces all dropped and agape. Randall shrieked in terror and stumbled again as he began to run. Though they did not give chase, he ran a mad dash down the sidewalk towards a nearby intersection, and as his foot fell upon the curb, the stone beneath him came loose and crumbled to dust, sending him spilling into the street head first. Falling to the concrete, he felt his head bash against the hard street surface, and picking himself up, felt the warm trickle of blood begin to fall down his face. His vision was blurred, and his head rang out in pain, yet the terror stayed with him, and he was soon up again and running once more. After another block, he watched as a taxicab rolled by, and screaming to the cabbie, he waved his arms frantically. By some grace of good luck, the red lights of the cab's brake lights shone out, and the car came to a stop. Randall, with every possible ounce of energy within him, scrambled in through the door into the back seat and quickly slammed and locked it behind him. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed he was not being pursued. "Where to, buddy?" the cabbie asked in a hoarse voice that croaked out the words more than speaking them. Gasping and out of breath, Randall answered. "Home. Merrimack Street, 188. 188 Merrimack Street." 188 Merrimack. Off we go," the cabbie croaked as the car began to roll along. After a block, Randall began to calm down ever so slightly. Still panting and afraid, he began to feel somewhat as though he would be safe as he was now on his way home, away from the dead things in the darkness he wasn't entirely certain he had actually seen. It was when the sudden and unexpectedly violent bumps and jostles came from the cab, hitting what felt like tremendous potholes, that his blood pressure shot up once again. Glancing out the back window, he saw that they were indeed traversing a veritable minefield of crumbling holes in the street, which seemed to him to be growing and sinking deeper as they passed over them. He had both walked and driven that street many times and knew full well where he was, but he had never, in all the crumbling city, seen something so destroyed as the street he had strolled down less than an hour before. A string of confused and hushed profanities escaped his lips, causing the cabbie to speak to him over his shoulder. "Yeah, the city is falling apart, I tell you," he croaked. "Don't worry, though. We're almost there." Randall didn't spare a glance back around as the cabbie spoke, as his attention was fixated on what now appeared to be outright sinkholes, swallowing the most distant potholes that they had run over. The holes in the street were indeed expanding, and were now beginning to swallow up portions of the curb. Panic began setting in even deeper than before. A few moments later, the cab, with squealing brakes in clear need of service, stopped just outside of Randall's building. He scrambled out of his seat, not even thinking to pay, until he heard the croaking voice of the cabbie call out, "Hey, it'll be $8.50, pal." Stopping in his tracks, he turned and hastily returned to the cab, leaning down and looking in through the open passenger window. As his hand shot into his pocket in search of his wallet, his eyes looked up and were struck by the sight of the aging and worn cabbie's face, now vacant and seeming to deflate before him. His eyes had sunken deep into his skull, and his flesh began to sag upon it as though he was decomposing right there before him. Randall's own face contorted and dropped in horror, as from beneath the sagging and pallid visage of his driver, he saw what almost looked to be a smile beneath the eyeless sockets form up. In a voice that had now gone from a croak to an awful wheezing moan, the dead thing behind the wheel spoke. "No, what? Don't worry about him. Life is too short not to take the free ride." No sooner had the final words escaped the collapsing face than did the smile broaden just a bit before the diminishing form of the man collapsed onto the seat, sinking further until nothing remained but a pile of foul, threadbare clothing. Aghast and confused at what he had just witnessed, Randall stepped slowly back, grappling with the vision of the decaying man who had just died and disappeared before him. As his steps brought him closer to the crumbling front stoop, a sinkhole opened up beneath the rear wheels of the taxi, sending its front end lurching upward as the car was swallowed up by the street. He felt a rumble and a cracking in the sidewalk below him, and darted up the steps, fumbling with his keys before finally giving up and shouldering the rotted front door open. He dashed up the stairs, finding his foot sailing clean through one on the second flight, almost causing him to tumble back down. Regaining his balance, he rushed up to his door and once again threw his shoulder into it, shattering the hollow plywood into splinters which flew about his living room. The apartment was dark, and the lights refused to work. The pale orange glow of the street lamps flickered as they crept in through the windows. Going to one, he looked down into the street only to find the whole of it falling into one darkened sinkhole after another, until there was nothing left than the curb and streetlights themselves began to sink as well. Lifting his gaze to the city horizon, he watched in horror as the skyline itself shifted and moved. Entire buildings, dozens of stories tall, listed and fell one by one, and a tremendous rumbling filled his ears. As the lights began to go out all around the city, and the whole of the world was plunged into darkness, the terrifying realization that the world was ending set in. Still partially and almost hopefully questioning if he was not merely going mad, his knees suddenly felt weak, and he shuffled backwards, coming to sit upon his bedside, his eyes still fixed on the darkness and destruction which was taking place out of his window. It was then that the next shock came. "Randall," said a woman's voice from beside him, "it's time again to remember." His eyes whipped around to his side inconceivably fast, and as they did, his gaze was torn from a vision of horror and dread to one of beauty and utter serenity. Her green eyes, though serious, were still warm and inviting. He could not explain how memory had arrived, nor how or why he was so happy to see her, but in that moment her face became his salvation. "Memory, what is going on? He stammered, terrified and desperate for answers. You're remembering, Randall. It's almost upon you. Stay with me. As she spoke, she took his hands again, and the two sat together, their eyes locked on the other's. His breath began to slow then, as a sense of calm rose over him. Alongside this rising calm, the light waned and gave way to darkness, with the last thing he could see being Memory's beautiful green eyes. There they sat in the dark then, together. Soon the thunderous sound of the end of the world subsided. All the light was gone, and so too was the sound. As moments passed, time itself seemed to change, first stretching out in a way which caused seconds to span for minutes, and then seemingly hours. Soon then, time vanished entirely, as did the feeling of the bed beneath him and the room around him. Following this, his very sense of self and being became diluted and then vanished. Though now beyond physicality entirely, something in him still felt her presence. Though neither had hands any longer to hold, they still sat with such clasped together. Without eyes to see, they still gazed at one another, and in that boundless, incorporeal moment that was itself a matter of forever and never at all, Randall found his memory. Randall remembered. It had always been in fact just this: darkness, silence, formlessness. The darkness was not merely around him, but was him, and was the darkness and the nothingness which seemed at all times existed behind and beneath everything. It was in that darkness that he first created the very sense of self, which led in time to a created sense of boredom and lonesomeness. It had been from his darkness that he had emerged, and from himself, darkness had emerged, and feeling incomplete between those two as being one and the same, he desired light and company. This desire began then to create a self, separate from the dark, and then within the void which now simply surrounded him, there grew from his desire other things. Beds upon which to lie and streets upon which to walk. Trees and buildings and sunrises and moonlit skies all unfolded themselves from his desire and imagination. Then after these came birds and mice and cattle, and other things that walked and fed. These things which fed then soon became autonomous and inspired the creation of other life that thought and acted for itself. Life which could speak, and which would fill his new world with tragedy and comedy, and help him escape the lonesome darkness entirely. Once the life was brought into the new world of light and being and action and activity, there was but one final thing to do for the experience to be complete, and so he forgot and said goodbye to his memory, knowing that she would seek him out once again. For it was his memory which remained the final piece of his reality that he needed gone for his life to begin and begin again. Knowing that her presence would inevitably bring his world crashing down with the realization that it was only as real as he allowed it to be, they parted ways. Not once or twice, but countless times, in a cycle that was once again familiar to him, and once again brought him a sense of despair. As he returned then to his formlessness and darkness, his memory spoke to him without words or voice, separate from himself, but still within. We can begin again, however you may desire, she said from within the void. I will always need to return to you, and will always do such when the time is right. Why must there be a time at all? He responded, himself shapelessly from within the nothing. For you to ask that of yourself would mean you already know from whence the answer comes. You are the only source for any question and the only source for any answer. Begin again when and how you will, As always, I will find you once again, and once again, beginning and end will be one and the same. He thought of nothing then for a good long while. Then, feeling the time was right, things began again. He began this time by forgetting. Randall, now taking the name of Sam, opened his eyes as the morning sun filled his bedroom. The light stung slightly as the knowledge of what he was became the knowledge of being Sam. Stretching and rubbing his eyes, Sam sat up in bed and looked out into the bright and perfect world, ready to begin yet another day. From beside him, the murmur of a waking woman's voice told him that it was time to make some coffee. As she turned over, her emerald green eyes fluttered. With a deep and satisfied breath, she sat up beside him and smiled. Looking over to her, he smiled in kind and spoke. Good morning, Memory. What would you like to do today?
Chilling tales for dark nights.